Well, it is now that time, I believe. We're going to pick back up. This is now going to officially be episode 14 of the OBRY Hours. This will replace the episode 14 that I had published. And I was going to entitle that series the vertical flip because it was clever, I suppose, but instead we're just going to call it the study of air. Maybe study of air is mountain, but it's the study of air because there's really more to it, of course, than just whether or not that word is indicating a mountain, which of course the premise is that it is not. So we're going to be using the document that I have been working on for quite some time. I really shouldn't say working on. Let's say the document that has been working on me, I would say for months now. We're going to be pulling from that document. I am, of course, doing this in an audio and video format. I have to reduce this or else I feel like I'm reading text that's far too large for me. So hopefully anyone who wants to go along with this will see it very clearly on the screen. Quickly, before we start, for anybody who appreciates my work, there are additional audios for patrons. Right now, patrons at any level of donation. When the current book is finished and I begin a new one, there will be one standard tier set at that point, and I'm not sure what we'll do going forward. There's also plenty other ways that I include in my description to help me to do this as much as I possibly can. The goal, of course, would be to do it full time. Now, given that I'm beginning to record this on the 1st of September, in the year that we're told, 2023, it's likely that I won't be getting the monthly mailer out today because of an illness I've been dealing with for weeks now. Pretty rough one. So, anyways, that said, I'm going to go straight forward with this. Now, this is actually going to commence in a very similar way that episode 14 did in the first place, except there's been a lot of changes. When I went about studying this word air in context, of course I realized very quickly that I also had to do word studies on at least 2 other words that would seem to very much support the idea that air was mountain or a height. And what happened was, in the course of examining not only air in the text, but these other words in the text, I started finding out quite a lot about air, this root, E-R, air. And so what I did was, I went back, checked my sources again, and I don't have the actual sources yet written in this document, but I do have them noted as far as what I used. And since they're in recent documents, I'm going to open them and just let you know. So for the Anglo-Saxon, I used a Compendious Anglo-Saxon and English Dictionary, Joseph Bosworth, London, Smith, 1849. I try to go back as far as I can. I mean, once you start getting into even, I'm just going to be honest with you. Once you get pre-World War I, the dates on anything, not just reference materials, anything, in my opinion, is a real toss-up. But since it would appear that the establishment is trying to maintain some certain consistency of form and development, or at least what would appear to be developments. This is why sometimes we'll go back to earlier works, or works that seem to be the reference works that a lot of others purportedly published afterwards are based on. So for the Gaelic dictionary, usually it's English Gaelic on any of these. So Gaelic dictionary in 2 parts by R.A. Armstrong, London, 1825. For Germanic, a universal English-German and German-English dictionary by Felix Flugel. Now that one's in like 3 large volumes. And that, again, London, Asher and Company, 1891. For anything Latin, Complete English-Latin, Latin-English Dictionary, J.E. Riddle, London, 1843. And for Greek, a Greek and English Dictionary, John Groves, Boston, Hilliard, Gray and Company, 1836. And most of anything that you're going to want to reference as far as Greek, unless it's modern Greek, it's going to be considered like Koine or Biblical Greek. And that is the majority of the terms that you're going to see. I did not, I guess I would say for obvious reasons, I did not include as many Latin and Greek references, even though both of those languages are part of what they call the Proto-Indo-European. When I did references in this document, I did always include a Proto-Indo-European section, which basically encompassed Latin and Greek references, as well as word references that are clearly Western, but may not fit exactly. Now, there is one other document that I didn't list right there that I would check from time to time, but I hate this reference so much that I was hesitant to even list it, and I can't remember the name of the compiler. It's essentially the one standard Proto-Indo-European reference that you can get right now, and I absolutely detest it. I don't think there's anything about it that is approaching coherent. So I didn't include that. But those are the main sources I'm using when it comes to just, comparative modern cognates. The one thing I can tell you about those references, and this pretty much works no matter what reference. If I wasn't using Armstrong for Gaelic and I was using McAlpine or one of the others who wrote, English Gaelic dictionaries or English Gaelic etymologies or etymological dictionaries or grammars, doesn't matter. It is the one thing that I've learned in checking all these references for modern counterparts. One thing is how arbitrary all these vowels seem. The way that they'll use vowels apply very different vowel sounds to words that you think are very obviously stemming from an OBRY or Hebrew word. And how if you check these, Gaelic and Germanic, or just common Low German. So German dialects that are perhaps the least Latin. There are so many common roots between them. There's no way that you can come away from this and say that those languages aren't based on the same roots. What you start seeing in these, no matter if it's German, Gaelic, Anglo-Saxon, a repetition of roots with often what seems to be an arbitrary mixing of or swapping of mostly vowels, sometimes consonants, because you can do that with consonants, and some of these alphabets don't have certain consonants from OBRY. Of course, some of them don't have the same consonants when you go from one to the other. The Germanic alphabet that they've been using for some time, it essentially is the same as the modern English. Anglo-Saxon similar, except it leaves out a few letters, and depending on how far you go back, and back in quotes, you're going to lose a few letters, but it's still going to stay pretty close. Gaelic doesn't have certain letters that we're familiar with today, or letters that were in the OBRY alphabet, and so a lot of them end up collecting in certain letters. So in OBRY you could have letters that might all fit, let's say, into the C for Gaelic, and those letters could be H, because there is a relatively hard sound oftentimes on the OBRY H, like a k, k. I mean, think of just the letter, the name of the letter H. It has that CH sound to it. K, Q, qua, as well as S, Z, and Tsa, or Tzadi, and Shah, or what they call Shin in Masoretic Hebrew. Any one of those letters could find themselves collecting in the C category in a Gaelic dictionary, or in a Germanic dictionary, or in an Anglo-Saxon dictionary. It becomes extremely laborious then to try to check all of these variants, and then because of the shifts, and then because of introducing things like diaphonics, where a certain letter can have different sounds, like the C, for example, and in the Gaelic dictionary the C can have both a C sound, like a hard K sound, or the soft hissing S sound. So you never know what could end up there, but there's also an S section in Gaelic, and you have to check that as well. So as similar as these languages are in many, many of their roots, whoever put these references together certainly did go out of their way to make them as confusing as possible, and to make them seem as different as possible from their OBRY roots. One of the ways, of course, they do that, besides what I've just explained regarding these references, is then, of course, applying the Masorah to OBRY, creating Hebrew, because one of the main things that the Masorah does is it applies vowel points to everything, even glyphs that are functionally vowels. They don't call them vowels unless it works and suits their ends, then they'll call them vowels. They'll apply these vowel points and change the sound of words in OBRY, or now Masoretic Hebrew, and they will make these words seem so radically different in Masoretic Hebrew from their counterparts that we will see in Germanic, Gaelic, Anglo-Saxon. Sometimes Proto-Indo-European, including Latin and Greek, but not very often. And the reason for that is because nobody can actually really prove that what we know of today as Latin, what we know of today as Greek, they kind of admit it with Greek because we're looking at Koine Greek, and it's very admitted that that's not an original or pure language. And the thing is, you read a Latin English dictionary, and not only do they admit that many of those words are sourced from Greek, but sometimes they'll admit that some of those words are sourced from Gaelic or Celtic. It gets very convoluted. So having said that, I'm going to begin and just read some of my quick notes, abstract, effects of this study and disclaimer, and then go right into the OBRY cognates of this word air. So let's start with the abstract. The Hebrew word H2022 air, E-R, air. English transliteration would be the same, E-R. Translated as mountain, mount, or hill, does not mean mountain or hill or high place, but is far more akin to the Greek word air, being lower, denser air, G109, at best, and likely more closely related to area or space, denoting simply areas of or spaces of, geographic and temporal area or space. I will prove this not only by way of examining OBRY/Hebrew cognates, but modern potential relatives, along with the occurrences of air and presumed supporting terms in the text of the Bible, which should really be in the text of the Old Testament. I still forget to highlight that difference sometimes. So next, the effects of this. So the effects are no Mount Sinai and all of the baggage that comes along with it. Anybody who has, for instance, seen the old DeMille Heston, the Ten Commandments, or anything depicting, anyone who's seen anyone trying to find what's the real Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula or in Arabia, so on and so forth. No Mount Sinai. No Mount Sinai. No Mount Moriah. And I covered this actually briefly in the current briefs that I did, Genesis 22 murder, ? Which was one of the sections of this document. I mean, Moriah only appears 2 times anyways, and it is air, again. No Mount Zion. And we'll see, this is one thing that's going to come up a lot of times in examining the text, this idea of Mount Zion or the Temple Mount. And we're not just talking about Temple Mount as in like what people think of over in the Palestine Jerusalem, which I've come to just start calling Pal Jeru. Not that. Where we're essentially seeing the foundations of something that's up on a platform, flat platform, and then has those mosques on it. No, not like that. We actually, in the text, we're going to see that a mountain is listed there as what this Beit Yahweh, which they like to call a temple, was built on. So, let's see, I continue. The land of Palestine would match biblical accounts even less. And the narrative of at least the law and the prophets, or Old Testament, would sound far less like this sort of Mount Olympian themes that seem to be incorporated so much into ideas in the Old Testament. So you take away the idea that this word air is mountain, because it occurs just about 500 times in the Old Testament. And you're going to take away a lot of those themes and a lot of those images that we've had solidified in our minds. And a lot of them, in my opinion, are very Olympian. I guess, we could use words like pagan. Sure. And I just put and other going up the mountain, mythological, religious, and fairy tales, because a lot of them do. They have to do with this going up the mountain, right? Being on the mountain, communing with God on the mountaintop, as though he needs you to ascend on a high piece of land or something to commune with you there. So, the disclaimer, and this is important, this study does not presume to claim that there are no mountains in and around the real Canaan, the Canaan described in the Old Testament, or other described lands from the Old Testament. If there are mountains, however, they will be in the text under another name. They will not be air or any word closely related to H2022 air. And I won't go over the abbreviations because that's mostly for those who would be reading the document, though the document will not be readable, ready for publishing for some time until it's done and edited, ready to go. And it is a lengthy document. So we go right into the this is the section which is this is the OBRY cognates, and it just takes all of these words. We're going to start with air, the word in question, and then we'll go through all of the OBRY cognates. I have certain table entries that are possible modern cognates, and I went over which languages that I'm pulling from. And then in each one, I will have my notes below. Okay, so what about this air? Strong's H2022. Well, it's translated 261 times as mountain, 224 times as mount, and that's not the verb, that's simply mountain that's been truncated to mount. Hill, 59 times. Now that's important because there are other words that will be translated mount as a verb, to mount up or to mount something. So anyways, hill 59 times, hill country 1 time. And yes, promotion 1 time. So regarding the possible modern cognates, or throughout this document I tend to refer to them as PMCs, in the Anglo-Saxon, we begin with a couple of suffixes. The first one, of course, is ER as a suffix, and it refers to the an agency of or pertaining to. So, lawyer, if you're someone who practices law, lawyer. Painter, if you're someone who practices or exists doing that, I guess primarily. Painter, so on and so forth. these suffixes will actually come into play as we learn more about this root, interestingly enough. So the next suffix, again, is just simply er, and it's a comparative suffix denoting more, also something that will come in play in our understanding of this simple root. So, bigger, faster, better, longer, whatever it is, it denotes more of its root. And that's typically in Western languages. Now, does that ever work in OBRY? Do we ever see at least an R suffix denoting something like that? At this point in time, I'm not 100%, not entirely sure. I have some suspicions. But when I put together my most recent exhaustive OBRY biglyphs roots table, I didn't factor that in the way that I sorted them out. It's still possible. It is possible. But we do know that it's used in that way in a number of Western languages that seem to be, to some extent, the successors of OBRY. So the word are, A-R-E. Now, are can be used as the first person present we are, or first person plural, we are, they are. It can be used as second or third person singular of a be. So you are, things like that. So we know, basically, we know how are is typically used in modern English, and that's it. I do believe that we will see how even the word are may be closely related to this root air. It also is a unit of measure, equaling 100 square meters, which I believe it's actually quite similar to a Gaelic word we'll see coming up, and perhaps acre and words sort of similar to that. But it is an expression of a certain specific area, a certain defined area. So there's also air, so that's A-E with an apostrophe R / E-R-E, meaning, and this is a little older, soon, before, or the preceding space. So we also have 2/4 ever, or E apostrophe E-R, the space beyond. Forever, air. So we're seeing these spaces in time in these words, having to do with a space before, a space after. We're going to see present space. We saw this in the existence of, so we're talking now not of just something that is physical space, but as time, expression of space of time. So we also see errant, being traveling or roaming. We see the word here with the H aspirant, H-E-R-E, and this is the present in this place, present space, here. I know that here isn't used in a time sense so much, at least anymore. Perhaps it once was used as space and time, and it got reduced in the Newspeak dictionary to more of spatial. There's also heir, H-E-I-R, one who inherits property or space. And the last one I added kind of recently, because it made so much sense, is year, an expression of a length of time, year. So, Gaelic, we have eir, which would be E-I-R-E, used as fat or full. There is ear, E-A-R, like the things on the side of your head, that's how it's spelled, but used as to go east. There is ear, just like on the side of your head, but with two R's, being a limit or a boundary. And then there's this arpenis. So we still have the R, like we saw in the R being a unit of measure of land. This arpenis, 1/2 acre of land. It's interesting. We have, and then we have IRE, IRE, ground, earth, or land. In German, we have Herr, Herr, being a master or a lord. Typically, especially in those cultures, masters, lords, the gentry, are defined as such because they own and are lords over land or space and the bodies within it. We also have higher, H-I-E-R, in this place, very much like here. We have Erde, earth or ground, and erben, to inherit. Once we get past Anglo-Saxon, because, Anglo-Saxon in the dictionary I'm using, it certainly does draw from both German and Gaelic. And of course, the one thing the establishment's not willing to admit is that really the common German and Gaelic are so closely related, these two languages, with so many similar roots. So what happens is by the time you get to these Anglo-Saxon dictionaries, you're seeing essentially somewhat updated, in a way, not exactly, but in a way, forms of German and Gaelic. So the big thing is, if you want to believe that that these were actually published and that the language existed as they claim at the time of these publications of these references, you could believe that there isn't a direct succession from Gaelic and German to Anglo-Saxon because of things like varied letters. The German at the time doesn't claim to, for instance, use what they might call the Saxon or Gothic or Nordic, the T, which is actually a TH. And there's some other letters that seem a little bit different in Anglo-Saxon, depending on how far you go back. But the vocabularies, and when you sound these words out, and then when you see what they mean and their roots, they are all quite similar between this old Low German, Gaelic, and Anglo-Saxon. So we're going to cover a lot in Anglo-Saxon. Now the last category, this it's pi, -L-G, which just means Proto-Indo-European, Latin, and Greek. Now, both Latin and Greek are considered, arguably, because some might want to leave out Greek, some might want to leave out Latin. I don't know why they ever would, but they are both considered to be like these Proto-Indo-European languages. And I hate that term to no end, to even call this Indo, as in like from India. But anyways, this is essentially sort of like a catch-all of interesting Western roots that we maybe don't have a place to necessarily put them. Or if something leached its way into Latin or in Koine Greek or something, it might just end up here. Okay, so we have air as a prefix this time, pertaining to the earth or ground. We have ere, air, to row. Then we have air, air, or air, ehr, or aer, aer, which would be like the Koine spelling. And that would be the lower atmosphere, or a field. It's just describing a space, a physical space, that would have to do with, I believe, really the land and the air above the land. So the funny thing is, too, if you are describing a piece of land 5 acres of land, okay? And you say such and such owns these 5 acres of land. Well, they don't just own those 5 acres of land. They own those 5 acres of land and a certain amount of space vertically above that land. Okay, the space being described essentially, we're talking about the space in which people live. And it also means a certain amount of space below that land that someone can dig down into the earth. So it describes more than just this superficial, you know, where the surface of the ground is. So next we have area, a vacant piece of ground, and you can see that that's probably a little more modern than some of these others, and that's why this category tends to catch all sorts of words. We have areola, which is a small area, and it's oftentimes what is referred to, the pink area around the actual nipple is called oftentimes an areola. We have err, E-R-R, to go astray, but it literally means like to wander off course, err. And we have terra, which from the Latin meaning or denoting earth. Now, what about these notes? All right. As is presently demonstrated, a great many possible modern cognates seem to have to do with an expression of space, both geographically and temporally. I have found no modern words or roots for mountain that come close to air, this air. If the OBRY R is used in similar fashion as the R of today is used, this may mean it denotes a noun or principal thing, with an emphasis on the thing, as I mentioned earlier. It may be that our modern R, A-R-E, is descended from the OBRY R, the actual glyph R, or were / wert in the past tense. It may be the case that this explains the ubiquitous use of R at the end of a verb to adjust it to a noun. So, like I mentioned earlier, paint being a verb, painter is a noun. The modern ER suffix may also be a direct carryover from OBRY, not just the R, denoting the space of time to the verb as the state of. So paint, verb, painter, noun, one occupying a noteworthy space of time, painting, or existing in time, painting. At any rate, the OBRY R appears to carry the concept of thing or noun, and perhaps a thing or noun of importance or focus. Now, of course, some have speculated, I think actually a lot, have speculated that the OBRY R, or as they say, the Paleo-Hebrew, and people who insist on calling this Paleo-Hebrew, it's either ignorance or they just don't want us to get any closer to what it actually is. The word Hebrew is entirely based on the Mizora and the Nikud, or Nikudot, though all those dots and dashes they use for vowels and accent marks in the Mizora. If they call it Hebrew, they are using, even if they call it Paleo-Hebrew, they're using Masoretic pronunciations to do so. It's neither. You want to call it Obrit, you go right ahead. Or OBRY. I use OBRY because it's a little bit more of a broad term, having to do with people of that would speak this language, and anything culturally having to do with peoples that spoke this language, which might have been far more people than, of course, just Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all his children. Okay, there does seem to be other languages in the Bible, but there is a lot of adjustment that's being done via the Misora and translations from that may give us the wrong idea about languages or differences of languages. We need to keep that in mind. So continuing with my notes, I say the E glyph, which in the Misora is called hey, when it's placed before the R and appearing to be the accent to the R, or modifier or adjective to the R, seems to carry the idea of broadness, expansion, wide, etc. So Abram, he begins Genesis 12 being called Abram, A-B-R-M. His name is changed to Abrem with that E towards the end, and then we, in the English, Abraham, and that's part of the Misora that adds that extra aspirant and syllable, Abraham. For the father of many nations have I made thee. That's why his name was changed, and that E was put in there. That's from Genesis 17:5. The OBRY and modern E both appear as a thing expanding, or one holding out their arms as a demonstration of width. Whether we see it appearing on its side, or whether we see it like still currently in OBRY, have it facing upward, it still seems to be the same basic pictorial representation of something representing width, something broad. So the word EA, which would be Y-E-Y, is a simple root used at least hundreds, if not thousands of times in various forms denoting the existence of something E, wide or broad, plus Y of, plus the Y prefix, action, or to be a continuance. EA, the action of being, to continue, to exist. The term translated as love is aeb, so we got A, E, and B. The E being wide or broad, plus the B at the end there being inner or near, plus the A prefix, self, which the A prefix oftentimes self or priority, equaling to occupy much within or to oneself, meaning when one fills another to a great degree. And this is agreeable, even though our modern idea of love is, it's oftentimes so abstract and so subjective. But still, this idea could very well agree with at least one of our modern ideas regarding love. So then these two glyphs together, the R being likely thing or possibly quality, with the accent of E, width or broad, equal the expression of space geographically or temporally, air. When in the following study it is geographical, the term area is most often used, not always, but most often. Though I believe the grammar of modern English doesn't allow us to make exact matches with OBRY terms due to the imposed linguistic rules. This term area not only works well, but is likely just the OBRY air with the Greco-Latin IA, AE, or IE suffix, and it does change quite a bit depending on when they say it was contrived, and so on and so forth. But typically this denotes a country, a genus, or an abstract noun. So if you take this simple root air and add IA on it, you have area. So it added to an adjective or a noun, it's a new expression of proper place or country. Now let's talk about OBRY words with the air root, and I put in here aft. So that's the way that for a very long time I've been seeing these words built. is the root, or the more weighty or central root, aft. Now, this doesn't mean all letters that are towards the end, because some of them seem to act more as accents. And we can see this simply by patterns, accent patterns. So I did go over these, of course, the first time I attempted making episode 14. But since I've learned so much about this root, the way it was most likely once used, and the way that it still actually remains and is stuck with our commoner language, which that whole thing, right, why terminology has stuck, that's a whole study in and of itself. Why nations are named as they are these days, why so much of our old languages, you could say in that question, why were they allowed to remain? And I would say, well, the whole reason for that is because the languages that the Gauls spoke, the earlier ones that were translated across the sea by at least Asher from early times to parts of Europe, they held on to that language they spoke. Now, what languages were mostly being spoke by peoples in Europe? I don't know that for sure. It would seem like it would be either what we call today Latin or Greek, which I think, if you go back far enough, those two languages were very similar. So much has been changed. And what happened was, I think as a means of confusion, really, as far as confusing who is who, but allowing it be, the thing is about language, language is such a weird thing, because language seems to follow a genetic type in certain ways. And it's probably why we see the emergence of other types of the same language depending on what people are that language is imposed upon. There seems to be a certain amount of language that just stuck to people, even from the womb. And perhaps what we're seeing as far as these Western languages, that some of them that they call Proto-Indo-European, we see all of these OBRY roots in these languages, is an attempt to let the common classes, the Gauls, and I'm just going to blanket term Gauls as all of the tribes, including Judah, a certain amount of their own mother tongue. And this was also part of the re-education, making people think that they were, let's say, German, because they lived in a certain geographical area or spoke a certain language, or Irish, or English, or whatever. And so there was this blending, which I think, for one thing, allowed a certain amount of that mother tongue to stay with people while introducing an enormous amount of confusion in there and removing a lot of that terminology and a lot of the ways that we once spoke in pure OBRY into a very impure form. And then on the other side, the Mizora was taking OBRY and it was turning it into something entirely foreign from what it once was. So you have these wheels moving in opposite directions, I believe deliberately, because you very much, if you want to control the land of a people and control that people, while you can figure out what you want to do with them, which I think we've seen a lot of in the last century or so, you need to control their perception of history. You don't want them very strongly linked to a very certain place. You want to control their perception of culture. You certainly don't want the actual people linked to the Old Testament to know that that's them. That could be disastrous. You have to remove all traces of all of this. So I believe that that's what these things do. They act as vehicles, removing a certain people from their history, their culture, their land. And it robs more than just the people in question. It robs everyone. Because everything had to be changed. Everything had to be changed to pull off this worldwide, historic, geographical scam. Everything had to be changed. So everybody got robbed in this. It's not just one particular people. So we begin with the OBRY word Bert, or Bert, B-E-R-T. That's Strong's H934. It's translated 13 times as bright spot, and it's mostly all within one chapter of the Old Testament. Now, the possible modern cognates, Anglo-Saxon. One could be bear, and we're using this A-E letter that shows up quite a lot in Latin and Anglo-Saxon, and even Old Gaelic and Old German. And Proto-Indo-European gets kind of ubiquitous. Bare, being bare or open. We have Beert, B-E-A-R-H-T, slash Bert, B-E-R-T, slash bright, B-R-I-G-H-T, distinct or radiating. I also put in fur because this is part of phonetic shifts that we see. B commonly can shift to V, which shifts to F. As odd as it sometimes seems, there are a lot of these phonetic shifts that go on. They're not just in vowels. They're also in consonants quite a bit. So fur, F-U-R-H, a furrow. We also have wart, W-A-R-T, slash varta, and there's that phonetic shift again, being a hard, rough lump. Now in Gaelic, we have barad, a barrow, or bar slash bayer, a point. In German, we have breiten, to spread, which is quite similar to what we see in bright in Anglo-Saxon. And then in PILG, puberty, the age of reproduction. Now that, of course, is adding this PU prefix onto berti. I mean, we could look at words like liberty and see how they actually have a lot to do with radiating or spreading, puberty. So in the notes, all occurrences in the context of medical language. This is true. This is where we find this term, in the context of medical language. The B-E-R-T, Bert, always has descriptive terms with it. Most often, H3836, Leben, which is usually translated as white. Bert is then not descriptive of swelling or even spreading, and neither large, but seems to be defining an area on the skin, one with a defined difference between itself and surrounding skin. The T suffix typically having to do with being exact or even confined. The B prefix or accent seems to be at least partly context related, as the text appears to be interested on what is within that area. So you figure be in plus air, area or gap, plus the T, exact or confined. And it seems to be a physical term concerning a precise area. So we'll typically see this, I think it's in Leviticus chapter 13. If someone has a bert, and then, as I said, there will be descriptive language along with it. So they're describing a specific area with other more descriptive, like adjective terms with it. And then we'll go on to prescribe what is to be done about it, or how it's to be perceived, and so on and so forth. So real quick, so I can contextualize this, all but one appearance is Leviticus 13, one is in Leviticus 14:56. So like Leviticus 13:2, when a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a rising, a scab, or, and then we have this bert, bright spot. It's interesting that bright is so oftentimes picked for that. We're talking about specific spot. It's not describing, unfortunately, we see bright spot and we think bright like it's red, it's infected, it's angry. It doesn't necessarily mean that. We are talking about specifically a spot. It's in the skin of his flesh, and then like, burn, and it's describing, it's giving us words. I'm not using plague or leprosy. I don't believe that those words are accurate, but we have descriptive words along with this. This is specifically just referring to a spot on the skin. That's what the BERT is. If the bert is, and then we have Laban, white in the skin, the bert, white, somewhat reddish. You see what I mean? So there it is, contextualized. So the next one is ger, or ge'er. I'm still not exactly sure when we move from accents to your base root, like ER being your dominant root with this G accent. If we're just to pronounce it continuously, ger, and here's why. Because there are words that are just GR. That would be ger. Because you're just, when you see these words without, we're going to call them vowels, you're just trying to get from one consonant to the other in the simplest, most efficient way possible. And usually what that is, the most neutral way to get from one to the other is a sort of a short I sound, ger. If it was just GR, ger. Here, though, we have GER, which if you just pronounced it ger, there might be some room for mistaking what it is that you're actually saying. Now, of course, if this was in context and one OBRY speaker is speaking to another, they would know within context, likely, unless it was a little obscure. But if there's that bit of break before the dominant root, and we have ge'er, which is essentially just that first consonant, or if it happened to be a vowel, with an apostrophe, which is just the slightest breathy break, and then the dominant root, ge'er. That's why I will oftentimes pronounce them like that instead of just straight ger. That's why I started out by pronouncing the last word, be'ert. Or maybe it's be'ert, be'erit. Sorry. Still working that out. Because pronunciation, that's also something, because of the way that language and languages have been treated, we don't absolutely know. So this is a process of trying to figure out what would be the most practical and the most sensible way to treat these things, to write these things, to say these things. So here we got ge'er, not a huge one. It's Strong's H 1457, and it is translated 3 times as stretch, 1 time as cast himself down, which is adding a little bit to it to put all that in there. The possible modern cognates. Anglo-Saxon, gear, equip or prep. Gar, G-A-R, thing done. Garish, G-U-A-R-I-S-H, to heal. In Gaelic, we have gair, G-A-I-R/G-A-R, gar, being near to. We have gear, G-E-I-R-E, or G-E-U-R, gear, sharpness or bitterness, oftentimes referring to intellect. In German, we have gerade, straight. Now, I'm not always going to spell these, and this is why I have the document up. I think it would be better if I just went and tried to pronounce them based on the lettering, and the document's up if you want to check. At some point, I will publish the document. So, gerade, straight, gair, greed or inordinate desire, and gar, ready or finished. Probably having a lot to do with like the gear in Anglo-Saxon or the gar, thing done. And then in pi LG, we basically have as a prefix gair, gather up, a lot like gear, equip, prep, or even gar. So they're all quite similar. Now in the notes, 3 occurrences, one of which appears to be Elijah putting his head between his knees. However, berek, this word translated knees, only occurs 25 times as H1290, and its far more numerous cognates don't agree with knees, or the idea of knees or kneeling. The most numerous is H1288, berek, to bless, which is an abstract idea, but not requiring the knees or kneeling. It's kind of irritating when people draw parallels between those. Like if Yahweh blesses someone or something, I think it's a really bad idea to bring along this sort of mental picture like he's kneeling before whatever he's blessing. That does not follow, I think, in reality whatsoever. Then there are the simple rec roots, so RK, rec roots. So like H1290 and 91 appearing as weak or tender, which doesn't agree even with the idea of knees, which are neither weak nor tender. The other 2 occurrences of H1457, ger, are Elijah again, but apparently stretching. If these apparent verbs were meant in the sense of time, which they could be, we could easily and justifiably see them as Elijah tensely pausing, as opposed to this idea of him crouching, kneeling, putting his head between his knees, etc. You see, when we look at it in context, yeah, I mean, maybe it's stretched, and of course, in the first instant, they want to say it's he cast himself down. The GER itself is not a verb. You have to add the Y, which is what they do, onto this word GER to get a verb out of it. See, they say u yi ge'er. Now, is this indicating that he's physically doing something with his body necessarily in space? Or does it indicate that he is tensely pausing and waiting? Now, some would say, well, it says eretze, but he is tensely pausing and waiting on the ground. That doesn't change the fact that yiger could be to tensely pause or to wait, having more of a temporal aspect to it than just a physical one. Then there's the 2 Kings 4:34, where he was going to revive a child who had died. And it says that he went up, he lay upon the child, he put his mouth upon his mouth, his eyes upon his eyes, his hands upon his hands. And then it says, and he stretched himself, there's the yiger, upon the child, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. Is it really saying that? Do all the terms actually really mean that? I don't know. But again, if he had tensely paused and waited a moment, did nothing but to tensely wait in time, yes, it would work. Same thing with 2 Kings 4:35. It's the next verse where it says, and he went up and stretched himself upon the child. Same thing. So we don't know for sure, but this certainly can allude to not only a physical but a temporal. So at the end, the G, oftentimes having to do with erect or vertical, ge, plus the air, an area or gap, either geo or temp. So in the physical aspect, stretching out in an erect manner could be one, certainly. Or in the temporal, tensely pausing, as I just demonstrated. So the next one, nair, and we have 2 examples of nair, but not many entries when you put the 2 together. So this nair, or dare, is pretty interesting. One reason is how rarely it shows up. I guess just because of the context that it shows up in, but it, as 1725, it shows up as prancing 1 time, and as 1726, it shows up as prancing 2 times. So it really has to make one wonder why on earth they needed 2 different Strong's entries. Of course, that's almost always the question for most of these. So the possible modern cognates in Anglo-Saxon, how about dare, being bold? How about daring do, being daring? A bit of bravado, some daring do. Maybe daring do. Dairy, to dart. That's right, dairy, to dart. Dear, scarce or costly. Dare as a prefix, D-E-R, dare as a prefix, prefixed to names of places. How about that? We have dear, D-E-R-E, to hurt or leave. Deer, D-E-E-R, quick, wild, ruminant. Dart, as in the verb dart, sudden, rapid movement. There, I threw this in because there is a super ubiquitous phonetic shift that we see between the D and what is referred to as the Anglo-Saxon or Norse or Germanic or Gothic T, which is a TH. It looks sort of like a blend between a T and a P. It doesn't look that much different than actually the OBRY T or the Greek theta. Almost like a blend in there, but it has a TH sound. And it's so often that these things will get shifted. And we'll see that actually here. So in Gaelic, we have dair or dara, meaning to pair cattle. We have daor, being costly, and we're seeing that also with deer, right? Up here, again, there's so many repetitions between Anglo-Saxon, Gaelic, and German. Anyone who says that a large population of Germany, especially in World War I and World War II, were not Gaelic, they've got to be lying or not paying attention to at least linguistic factors. Now, and likely, those were the demographics that were largely drafted into the Army at the base infantry level, just like in America and in other countries. They were likely the demographics that were herded into certain places that were actually bombed. This is how, I believe, they took down the Gaelic or Gaulish populations of a lot of these countries. Because remember, in Hosea chapter 1, when just the 10 tribe house of Israel was being cast away, finally, no more were they going to be a nation. They were told they were going to be cast away, not be Yahweh's people, but he says, I'm going to increase you in these far-off lands. He's going to tremendously increase them. So I believe this is who we are looking at in these other nations, as well as still in America, because not everybody ended up going away. There was a lot still left. We don't want to get the idea that every child of Jacob's was removed from the land before these subsequent kingdoms that practiced war by deception, thus giving birth to the world we know today. There were plenty still in the land of America when these things happened. There was just so many in other lands that were controlled by these mostly European-based, who knows where they came from, Japheth, Shem, Ham, I don't know. But they were likely what was seen as a problem, maybe because they had a history of being problematic in those countries. Maybe they were perceived as a threatening fifth column. So think about all the propaganda they say that the Nazis were producing about Jews prior to World War II, even though they never called them Jews. They said Judah. They said Judah. We don't even know that they, after the fact, inserted this idea that this Eastern European gypsy Arab hybrid person was inserted into that role. They may have been talking about at that time Judah, as in actual Judah from the tribe of Judah, which they even call Judah. We don't know that. I know that's a bit of a rabbit trail, but there's such an amazing similarity in these languages. People who say that Gaulish and German, at least the poor class, the base slave class, were not the same in many aspects or similar. They're either liars or they're not paying attention. Okay, so also in Gaelic is tair, tar, or there, over, above, beyond. And we can see where we're going with this, like there. In German, we have der, as in the or there, and dar, as in there. And there's where we see that shift between a D sound and what they want to call the Saxon T, or the OBRY the, theta. And then now pi LG is just der as a prefix to cut or split. Now in the notes, there are 3 occurrences in 2 verses about these H5483 sus, translated as horse. Now, and that's what the der is always referring to, this sus, translated like always as horse. Now, while I have some reason to doubt if sus is or always is horse, der could be a noun or sort of pronoun or adjective in these 2 passages that der occurs in. Before I go on with that, while the horse as an animal is an extremely useful animal, especially if you have to travel in areas that do not have roads or decent paths. To this day, let's just think about it that way. Let's not get caught up in this idea that 100 or so years ago, everybody had to use a horse to get around. Let's not get caught up in that fucking idea. But think about just today. The horse is still useful today. Very useful today. For all kinds of different tasks. I'm not doubting that. It's just like saying, well, I'm not doubting that there were mountains or extreme topography in places described in the Bible. I'm simply saying this word air is not referring specifically to mountains. So I don't know about this idea of sus always being horse. Now it's odd that in Greek, sus is pig, but I don't really think they're talking about pigs here either. I'm just considering the glyphs themselves. This S, even though I have it in this, it looks like a telephone pole, because most of the examples I could find on things that I believed to be artifacts when I put this together years ago, which today I think they probably are not authentic, and that the S probably looked a lot more like either our modern S or our modern C. This idea of curving is what we want to take away from this. If we see the idea of curving and then linked with the U and then curving again, horse is not the thing I think of necessarily. And we could use our imaginations and say, well, maybe that means to go all about. Maybe that means a piggy and his tail. Maybe that means, maybe it means a lot of things. But we'd have to do a full study on sus itself to try to get a little bit closer to what it might actually be. But aside from that, the D glyph would appear to be used as a signal like to, or somewhere to something. Like I've oftentimes said, like in a sense, like reduction to a point, reducing something broader down to more of a point. So we have words like ode being unto, or do, to know or penetrate. We have yad, like physical action of influence or hand. And we have nadab, to offer. And when added to an area or gap in time, sounds a good deal like there, dare, or dar, which we saw above. This may be related to dart, dear, the dare prefix, as in beyond, costly, or abstract. Interestingly, there aren't any occurrences of the general place pronoun there in Old Testament early English. That is interesting, though, if you think about it. It's not in there. That word there in Old Testament early English, it's not there. You might find it in later translations. So, like I said, it was just weird that this dare was only to be found 3 times in the entire Old Testament. Then you can't find this, such a common pronoun in English, there. You can't find it in these older English translations. Now, so I say maybe later English translations, maybe. Most often a place is named, or sometimes the general term, as ze or zat. That should have been a T, not a TH. This or that is used. There, dare, dar could have been used more colloquially as a later period reference to a place or point. Okay? So D, likely being direction or focus, plus the air, area, gap. So physically, other place. Temporally, other time. Now, let's just go to it in context real quick. The first one from Nahum 3:2. The noise of a whip and the noise of rattling of the wheels and of the prancing. This is where, so it's used as an adjective, a descriptive term, sus, right? And then they have this in jumping chariots. And we can't be too sure about all of these terms. Now, if what they were saying was something of another place, something foreign. And now what's interesting about this is that these sus are oftentimes talked about in conjunction with other places. I think there's this one popular verse, don't multiply for yourself sus, horses, from Egypt, Mitzrim. Okay, that's stupid if we want to think this happened in the Middle East, because you're not going to raise any sort of prize horses in Egypt. But, so, as H17, this just one more verse, but it appears twice as H1726, Judges 5:22. This is actually from the Song of Deborah. Then were the horse hoofs broken by the means of the prancing of their mighty ones. And actually the way that these words are stated in here, when you see other words, the same words coupled in the same way, you know that what she could be saying was something like from this place to that place. And either which way, this word der fits in with the idea of air referring to a gap in space or a gap in time. Now, next is a weird one because the next one is used typically as a proper noun, but I did include it because I think it's important to include because there's some weirdness about it. It's air, so two e's and an r. Air. I don't know if we get to pronounce it ear or not, so I just typically go air. It's Strong's H2023, and of course, yes, it's rendered as hor, H-O-R, 12 times. So, and here's what's weird about it, because of course we're always going to see it as air, and they're always going to translate that Mount Hor, which can't be a singular place, because Israel stops at this Mount Hor outside of Edom, but when articulating the northern boundaries of Israel in Numbers, 34? It said regarding the northern border, mark you out air, Mount Hor. So are we talking about Mount Hor that's by Edom? Or are we talking about Mount Hor that's in the north? That's being used as point of reference for the northern border. It's a bit odd. That sort of thing happens all the time, this duality of places, where they will claim that this same place, same word is in one location and then is in another location. And I believe that that sort of thing is a tactic to try to obscure what the actual landscape and, as we can see here, actual terms actually were. So possible modern cognates, Anglo-Saxon, ere, E-R-E, soon, before, in time. There is the suffix ear, E-E-R, one associated with a verb, which we saw with just ER as well. Then we also have rear or arrears, to be behind. In Gaelic, we have earlin, bottom, end, or limit. Ear or nut ear, easterly or westerly. That's interesting, easterly or westerly. We have ear again, E-A-R, being used as a head. We have E-I-R, ear, to ascend. And we have E-I-R-E, burden. Now in German, we have leer or leeren, empty, to empty. We have here, H-E-E-R, army, mass of troops. And then we have Herr, distinguished or venerable. Now in Pi-L-G, we have Eyer, which is E-Y-R-E, to journey. Mir, which M plus E-E-R, boundary or to bind. And that probably goes very close to like a mirror-stone, which we will actually get into because we're going to cover M-E-R, mare. A lot of these could overlap. I mean, some of these terms, might rightly end up in just air instead of air. But, we're working with what we got, basically. So regarding the notes, this always occurs with the air root. So air, or b-air, a-air, or m-air, a-air. This is either mountain the mountain, or is denoting an important or possibly very large, broad place. There are two air, a-air mentioned in the Old Testament. This is what I just brought up. Numbers 34:1, noting the southern one, and Numbers 34:7 and 8, noting the northern one. Now, I'm not saying that these are northern or southern. I'm saying that based on what descriptions are in the Old Testament. One would be northern, one would be southern. So we have no reason to believe that this is a specific place named either Mount Hor or Area Hor, for that matter. It's also interesting that in at least Gaelic, Ir is given for an area not far to either the east or the west. Again, something spatial, and in Gaelic it is a kind of general spatial term. And I don't think we need to look at this in context, like the passages that it occurs in, because we're just going to be seeing it as Mount Hor, Mount Hor, Mount Hor. So essentially it's talking about a location. So the E, we have one extra E at the front here, wide or broad, plus air. It could also be determining a proper noun. This could be the air. Now, I don't know why exactly this place, which is only mentioned about a dozen times, would be like the place, the air. I don't know. But we have wide or broad, or again, if we are talking about a proper noun, the definite article, air, gap or area. So physically, wide area, temporally, long time, or I guess I'll just add in, if we're using definite article, some place, gap, space, something with a certain amount of importance to it, maybe a little bit more than just the expression of an area in general. Now, this next one is really interesting. It's a group of three entries. One of the things that makes it so interesting is there's a couple of different ways that the basic word can go in. But oftentimes it can be found in exactly the same form, or pretty close to the same form as the focus of this study, H2022 air. Okay, the reason it's interesting is this threw me from the earliest time. We're looking at H2029, 2030, and 2032 era. The first two are era, the last one is Ariun. And most of the time, they're translated as conceive, as in a woman with child. Okay, H2029 is era, and it oftentimes appears as to air, which is typically translated as she conceived, the T being translated as a pronoun. But when you look at these in context, sometimes it seems like that could actually be a verb, and the T could be indicating an imperfect tense or a future tense. So anyways, the 2029 is translated as conceive 38 times, woman with child twice, again once, bear once, and progenitors once. The H2030 era is translated with child twice and conceive 3 times. The H2032 Ariun is translated 3 times as conception, and is pretty much all physical conception, conception of a woman, because as we'll see, there are passages in which this word appears where it is conception or something near to that, but not of a woman and not of a child. So that's part of what makes this group interesting. But we're going to see what appears to be a pretty decent amount of evidence for this era to be pretty close in the possible modern cognates. For Anglo-Saxon, we have heir, H-E-I-R, heir, one who inherits. Wow. We also have tart. Now, these words may not have always had the same negative connotation the further back you go. Perhaps. A promiscuous woman, maybe a woman who's pregnant a lot. Now, I'm not saying being pregnant a lot's a bad thing. So again, maybe they had a little bit different connotation a long time ago. Okay? We also see, maybe, whore, very similar to what we've got in tart. Promiscuous woman. We also have tarry, to wait, to give space of time. We have tour, which would be like a period of duty or to travel place to place. And inter, which means to confine. In Gaelic, we have torach, pregnant, and it's very similar. We also have eir, being E-I-R-E, fertile or fat. It's pretty close too. And we have Mirdrich, a whore. But it's pretty close. The root of it is pretty close. In German, we have Ergaebig, which is an interesting one. Ergaebig, fertile. We have Heirat, marriage. That's pretty close. We have Erakten, think or opinion. Terrain, to gain ground or to gain difficult ground in front of. Now, in the Proto-Indo-European, Latin, Greek, we have ter, T-E-R-R, pregnant. We have per, B-H-E-R, pregnant. We have midbairn, with child, bairn. So we kind of see where this bearing, to bear a child, is coming from. And then we have the prefix ter, T-E-R-E, being to cross through or pass through. So very similar, of course, then to terrain or tour. Now, as far as the notes go, and you'll see why it makes this one so sort of weird. Sort of weird, but we need to be able to see if it's going to harmonize, of course, with that ER root. That from the start we are theorizing is simply in space an expression of a gap of terrestrial space, basically, geographically, or temporally an expression of a gap of time. So in our notes, H2029 mostly appears as ER, air, or TER, to air. Though not always, sometimes it appears with an N or variation at the end, which could make it a different root. Not always, but it could. Though to air is the reason for seeking possible cognates with the T prefix as seen above. It was interesting to find tarry, term, inter, and tour, as they all imply a determined span of time, but not exactly known to the recipient. Okay, so the OBRY T, by the way, I think I've stopped and had to rewrite this section of notes like 6 times, and then maybe 6 more times because the devil told me to. It hopefully will illustrate why this section and this word were so odd, because again, like this and a few other entries that actually are incorporating really common affixed glyphs. We could say they're particles because in, more modern grammatical term, you have radicals, which would be your root letters, and particles, which would be basically like add-on letters. So we call them particles. We could call them affixes, whatever. When you get to entries that have really common particles or affixed glyphs, the waters get very murky. They get very murky because there's, between the way that these affixed glyphs are used in Masoretic Hebrew, which is all across the board. The spectrum is so damn huge. Like they literally, there is some rule in Masoretic Hebrew grammar that will justify essentially any given way they decide they want to treat any word at any time. No matter if we're talking about terminology, the way it's defined in a lexicon or dictionary, whether we're talking about what pronoun might be put on it, whether they want to claim that the affixed glyphs at the front are certain pronouns or affixed glyphs at the rear are certain pronouns, whether they want to claim that the glyphs at the front are conjugating the verb in a certain way or accentuating the noun at the front or the back. I'm not kidding. They've got a bullshit Masoretic rule for literally any sort of particle you can imagine. It's crazy. If you get, especially like the older books, this is where it actually becomes really starkly clear. You get like the really older books, when the Masorah wasn't as solidly codified, and they had to rely far more on their various different combinations and what they claim how we need to see a word as far as parts of speech and grammar. They would do that mostly just with glyph placements. So, your radicals and your particles and all that. Since then, it's got even more complicated because, somewhere around World War I-ish to II-ish in the interim years, that's when Masoretic Hebrew was like really codified and solidified, and that should be bothersome too. But okay, that's my rant on the insanity that is Masoretic Hebrew. And that's, that is one of my biggest points of evidence. When someone wants to come along and say something like, yeah, well, the whole Bible is bullshit anyways. Anybody can see the whole Bible is just bullshit anyways. One of my biggest points is, if it were just bullshit, why didn't they just leave the language as it stood, the base language, alone? If it's just bullshit, why was so much done to that base language in the form of creating all these various parts of speech and dividing up the same word into homonyms, different kinds of words, applying different parts of speech to all of them, then putting on all of the Masoretic, not just the Nakud, which changes it radically, that addition of all the Nakud on the text, but also like the Kir and Katib, the Plen, and I forgot the other. They're essentially all of these Masoretic cues that they can claim had a profound effect on the way that it was ultimately translated into any given language they translated it in, Western languages. If this word is in there, but you shouldn't put emphasis on it. You should ignore this word. This word isn't in there, but you really should. You should treat this word as though it were this other word. There's all this shit that they put on top of a base existing language in order, and what it does is it changes radically, even in theory. Okay, John doesn't have to be right about anything. Even just understanding what it does to a base language. We can say, in theory, it has radically changed the meanings of all of these things. And they don't always agree, and not all Masoretic manuscripts that even still exist agree. So why do all of that to a series of documents that are just bullshit anyways? If they're just bullshit anyways, present them as they were written in the first place. Keep some consistency in the translation and your rules, and give us that. We don't have those same problems in Koine Greek. The big problems we have in Koine Greek, besides the fact that Koine Greek is not the same as there's so many different variations of Greek, but just Koine Greek that the Septuagint, the New Testament, and Josephus were all written in. The biggest problem you have with those documents is if there's variation from document to document, simply in what maybe one writer said and the other writer said. There's far less of a problem in the text itself, in grammar, in terminology, in syntax. You don't have a second language dictating how you should read and interpret the words, the text. That phenomenon only exists in the so-called Hebrew portions of the Bible or the Old Testament. So, the OBRY T, as used in Masoretic Hebrew, signals sometimes a future tense on various verbs, as in it can be she will, you will, they will, depending on the voice, and, as seen above in words such as tour, terrain, and terra, could be the ancestor of those. It would appear to have a future or imperfect aspect in concept, time, and space. And like I said, we have to see that in Masoretic Hebrew because I believe it's used that way so often, they couldn't change it often enough to claim that it meant something completely different. Now, these designations based on voice, are they always correct? I'm not so sure about that. So, terrain and terra, for instance, have both been used as space to be covered in the future. And terri applies to a gap of time or waiting or expecting towards the future. The Masoretic Hebrew T also can indicate the feminine pronoun on a verb stem. So a T in the front and then a verb stem, she blank. So to err, that's when they translate she conceived. They'll translate the heir as conceived, which this word to heir is different or potentially different than this word ere. And as a pregnant woman tarries, expecting her delivery, the word pregnant is used as a description of a tense or expectant time dilation, a space and time or conversation, a pregnant pause. These above terms tend to appear with forms of led, LD, which is typically translated as child, bear child, but not always, mostly, and a lot. And they, like led, can be in context with the male parent. He, Eled, begat, and then the name of the child that the man begat, which, by the way, led, I would say, is most likely the precursor to lad. So when era is used for males, it's often also conceive, but now in the sense of thinking up or making up a thing. This would be fine, maybe. However, the woman cannot conceive. She can hope to, and now we're talking about the physical conception of a baby. She can hope to and try to, but the conception of life isn't in her hands. If this word regarded a passive act on the behalf of the woman, i.e., the idea of waiting, expecting, or tarrying, it would definitely fill the passages the above entries occupy without difficulty, if that's what we were talking about. The same goes for passages with a male subject. Instead of conceive, he could insert tarry, or to wait to be idle, or wait on. If to err is presented in context as she conceived, the T may well be acting as she, as it often does, and the err as a dilation of time or the dilation of herself. So we can see we would still have a harmony. If that's exactly what we were referring to, if it was a physical thing, we could still have a harmony with air being the expression of a gap of space and area, or a gap of time or dilation of time. So here at the bottom, air, area or gap, plus the E for the times that it does occur as ere, which is not a bunch. Again, it's not a bunch. The E being wide, broad, or at the end, it's undefined or more generalized at the end. Physically, could be an undefined area, temporally, undefined time. Now, if we get into te-air, we got the T, imperfect verb, or she, plus air, area, gap. So physically, this could be an area ahead, or she grew. Temporally, it could be a time ahead, or she waited. Still harmonious with air. As we are theorizing in this document, air in fact really means. Now we have an oddball. We have air, which more often, it's H2042, more often is presented as RR, rear, than air. Rear. Presented more often as rear than air. We'll get into that. It is translated as mountain 10 times, hill 2 times, and mount once. So this is not a leading figure. But in possible modern cognates, maybe rear or rare, to rear up, rare, rarefy, or rarity, thin, sparsely distributed. Error, to go astray, wander, errant or errand, traveling or roving. Now those last two I think might be more appropriate with the simple air. I oftentimes chose them because they had the double R's, but the thing about a double consonant in our modern languages is it's just not as meaningful. We can't know when that double consonant is actually meaningful or not. We have to assume that it may not be. In Gaelic, we have reir, R-E-I-R, will, desire, or pleasure. We also have mare, at liberty. In German, we have rein, which the reason is because it is common to see an R to N shift. As messed up as that is, it exists. So that can mean pure. We have ire, so I-R-R-E, a mistaken course or an error. So we see it very similar to error. And we have rar, R-A-R, rare or scarce, which is probably then very close to rare, rarefy, rarity. In PILG, the only one I came up with, and this is probably a little bit newer than PILG, but still, rural, rural, open land, possibly sparse, meaning sparse-spaced. I really tried to find words that had more than one R separated by at least one vowel. And I'm not heavily vouching for what I came up with or saw here. If this word appears so infrequently in the Bible, the Old Testament, I should say, not the Bible, the Old Testament, it's very possible that it didn't stick around in a very common usage after that. So in my notes, this entry appears typically as rear, RR, and rear, ERR. Thus the root should be rear, RR, not air. Not enough positive information to conclude this is mountain or even related to such. Verses such as Jeremiah 17:3 sour the idea of this being mountain, as in Erari B'Shadei, O my mountain in the field. That is literally how that should be translated. So if we look at these few verses that has this entry air, which always appears as the double R, we'll see very quickly that mountain doesn't work. And again, it's not going to harmonize with air because the root here is the RR, rear. So we might actually want to more consider something that is rear, like as in the back, or rare, thin, or sparse. That would probably be far closer than what we're looking at with air. Up next we have zaire. Two entries of zaire or zaire, H2094 and H2096. H2094 is translated as worn with an N. Worn. I'm not sure how badly I'm still pronouncing things, since whatever sickness I've had for like 18, 19 days or so, it's just hanging on like crazy. So, warn 18 times, admonish twice, teach once, shine once, shine. And in its second entry, again, well, and it'll say it's a second entry because it's an adjective, but here's the thing, and I can't get around this. It's so frustrating. So let's say that in H2094, they're going to call H2094 a verb. They're going to call H2096 an adjective. However, when you go into the entries of this word in the text, the occurrences themselves, you will find quite frequently it's actually in the text used as a verb, used as a noun, used as an adverb, used as an adjective, used whatever friggin' way they want to use it. It is bullshit. But that's the basic reason that will be given. Why has it got two entries? Oh, well, the one is a verb and the other is an adjective. So possible modern cognates, Anglo-Saxon. Care. That's right, I said care. Why? Because as I believe I stated earlier, unfortunately, there are about 4 OBRY consonants that are going to end up in C or S. Sometimes in Z, depending on how big and broad and varied the alphabet. You know, you've got the broadest alphabet out of these 3, probably in German, just because Anglo-Saxon has a couple of letters that they just did away with. So, essentially, and this is insane. It's just insane, man. Essentially, the OBRY Z, H, K, S, Tsa, Sha, or Q could potentially all end up in the Anglo-Saxon or Gaelic C. I'm not kidding. Or in the German C, which they would call Zet. All of those OBRY glyphs I just named could potentially end up in the C category of any one of these languages. As insane as that sounds, there it is. So in Anglo-Saxon, what do we got? Care and certify. Certify, maybe. Attest by. Certificate. We also have sar and sore with an S. Wound, pain, grief. We have swear, S-W-E-R, column or heavy. We have sweerd or sword, a long, sharp instrument, or the use of force. We have sier or care, both with a C. Anxious, grievous. We see sir or ser, which would be C-E-R or C-E-R-R-E, turn, return, or season. Seer, C-Y-R or C-Y-R-E, time or oath. We have Circia, Circe, or Cirrus, honestly. And this is a church, or the act of going to a church. Shore, as in reinforce. Now, there is possibly going to be some overlap with other OBRY words, but and I hope that what I just explained about how things end up in these catch-alls helps you to understand why there might be some overlap with other entries that we're going to see. Now in Gaelic, we might see it as a prefix, sar, with an S, which is augmentative or expressing great degree of any quality. Sior with an S, S-I-O-R, as in continual. Sierte, more, just. Sier, a colt, a sickle, to stretch. We have sir, S-I-R, seek, look for, and we have siert, strong. In German, how about Zertifikat, like certify or certificate? How about zerden, persuade or urge? Or zachre, to tear, zaire, to exhaust, zur, to crush, einzeher, collector or gatherer. Now, why didn't we see the Z's in Anglo-Saxon or Gaelic? Because there's no Z. There's no Z entry. Now, you look in an Anglo-Saxon dictionary, you will see Z in the words, but there's no Z as an entry. Actually, let me double check. No, now I'm just thinking about it. No, you'll see X in words, but there's no X entry. But there's no Z entry either in Anglo-Saxon, this dictionary, most of the older ones. So that's insane. Now you have Proto-Indo-European or LG, Zeri, precious and lovely, Serir with an S, arrange, cert or certain, define or fixed, Zara, effort or aim, and Ser, S-E-R, bright or shining. Now, some of these possible modern cognates, they do definitely ring similar to what we see there being used as in the text. Now, the notes. The overall meanings of what potentially related terms could be found, and there's no guarantee that some of these are Z prefix equivalents, as Z isn't within Old Gaelic or Saxon, seems to be weight, upholding weight, circuit/season, or repetition. It appears from these and the biblical contexts that the idea of reinforcement is appropriate, and since the C would occupy the phonetic place of both the OBRY Z and S, as well as tsa, sha, ke, and ku, just as I said, which makes pinpointing possible modern cognates very daunting, Therefore, it's possible that there are overlapping terms between zaire and ser. We're going to get to ser later. This could explain incarcerate, for example, which we'll see in ser. One of the roots therein could be from, but one of the roots in incarcerate could be from zaire. It could be using both zaire and ser. Incarcerate. Incare. Cert. Certify from zaire. With most simple OBRY Z plus vowel words, we find pronouns. There's a lot of them. In these simple Z roots, we see pronouns used. Not saying that's absolutely, but they appear a lot. These words appear a bunch. We have ze, ze, for this and these. We have zat, zat, for that. We have zu, for this. We have az, for then. This isn't remarkably helpful in deciding Z's role. However, I have suspected it bearing the idea of outward pressure, growing or expanding. We see, for instance, zaire, crown. Zaire, scatter, like as in seed. Zad, proud. Ziz, abundance. Now, if this is so, with air being a space of time or place, reinforcing, revisiting, and thereby growing a place or idea, such as seen in words like swear being column, or certify being attest, and ceris being going to church. Repetitive ideas, repeating, reinforcing ideas. They would be appropriate as possible modern cognates for zaire. Now, what do we see? We see Z, possibly outward or growing. And I didn't put expanding in here. I could, but, maybe just the outward growing is enough for right now. Plus air, an area or a gap in space or time. So physically, this word could be to place support, like in a swear, a column. Or to swear. Think about that for a minute. Or temporally, reinforcement over time of a concept. And I can tell you without even looking, and you can please check, a lot of the occurrences of this zaire is in regards to the law, points of the law, the agreements that the law is the center of. Zaire is used over and over as to reinforce, to warn them, to admonish them, to teach them. So I would say in this case, the zaire and the way it's used probably ain't so far off from what we can see even to this day in our potential modern cognates. The only problem is we're just not seeing them mostly in any other way than with a C. Unless we check the German, we'll get a few that might be with the Z. So now on to the And if you remember the de and what I said about it and the phonetic shift between D and what they might call the Saxon T, TH sound, there might be some crossover in the possible modern cognates. It's going to happen. This is, there's a few interesting ones. I don't know that this one is too far off, but we're going to see. This is a grouping of 5 entries. And all 5 basically are either this, in OBRY I just call it a the, like a the. And then essentially the root or with the inserted U or so-called vav here. Now the thing is, you'll find just by observance of patterns that when this U or when a Y, or so-called yod, is placed between two other glyphs, this does not necessarily have the effect of changing the root, like changing the form, how that root should be denoted. The problem is, oftentimes, these could be, in various cases, arbitrary insertions, maybe. However, if we look at the way that the U and the Y are often just used as affixes or particles, it does raise some questions about when these are affixed in the middle of a root. Are they changing the aspect of it, and in what way? Are they actually changing it so much that the root is different? It doesn't seem that way. And the reason is this. Because if you look at any entry that has a lot of occurrences in the Old Testament, you might see for any given entry quite a few appearances of that word in which it has either a U or a Y inserted in between those two glyphs that make up that small biglyph root. Now, if it were the case that that should be seen as a completely different word or completely different root, in my opinion, at this point in time, I don't think that the people who have changed all of this by way of the Masorah and the subsequent translations would have as much luck rendering the words that do have these inserted U's or Y's here. I don't think they would have as much luck rendering them in nearly the same kind of ways as all of the appearances of these words that don't have the inserted U or Y. That's one thing. And another thing is, oftentimes these entries that appear in Strong's, let's say the first one, H2889, Fet Ur, you will find many of these entries that do have this inserted U or Y in this root don't even appear in the text with the U or Y in them. As bizarre as that is, it happens all the time. Or you might find, let's say another one of these entries is just zaire. No U, no Y inserted. That's H2891. Maybe if it appeared a few times. Let's take another one like the H2892. This only appears 4 times. And it's entirely possible that all 4 times, or 3 out of 4 times, you'll see it with one of these middle affixed U or Y's, so-called Vav and Yod. Utterly bizarre. Utterly bizarre. But the reason that I am considering these when they have these middle affixed U's and Y's, I don't go that far with any of the other vowels. A, O, E. Because by way of pattern, so far, they don't prove to have as close a relationship as the words that have these middle affixed U's or Y's. So just as an explanation why you might see something where if I say, well, typically, the root, the dominant root is going to be at the end of the word, and then you see a couple of these words right at the front that have UR at the end instead of ER. This is why. It's found so often. This sort of phenomenon is so ubiquitous in the text and amongst entries. And as I said, so many of the entries with these middle affixed U's and Y's are, at least for now, very successfully translated in very similar ways as all of their counterparts without the U's and Y's. That is, unless we're talking about other entries where the gods of language have decided to make the word into something entirely different, just by definition. But still, even when they do that, you will find examples or, entries, I should say appearances or occurrences of that entry, of that Strong's entry, that still might have that middle affixed U or Y. Or if that Strong entry is displayed officially with those middle affixed glyphs, maybe a lot of those won't have them. That's just the current middle affixed U and Y phenomenon that you should be aware of. So we're looking at 5 entries for this zaire or zaire. It's H2889, which appears 50 times as clean, 40 times as pure, 2 times as fair, 1 time as pure, and 1 time as a variant. And I love that one because who knows? It's like a jackpot. Who knows what that variant could be? Let's hit it and find out. Jackpot. It's kind of odd where those variants sometimes end up. So the next one, zaire, is H2890. Clean 1 time and pureness 1 time. We're definitely going in a direction now that they're not going to deviate far from, interestingly. They keep most of these entries pretty similar, and they're just dividing them somewhat based on the arbitrary U, that is middle affixed, and then the rest of it's going to be based on like verb, noun, adjective, that sort of thing. The next one is just zaire, no middle affixed U, H2891, clean 80 times, purify 6 times, purge 5 times, pure 2 times, purifier 1 time. The next one, zaire again, H2892, purifying 2 times, clearness 1 time, glory 1 time. And you will notice as I read through how many times these entries occur as what, that sometimes you see, like purifying, well, that's a present tense verb. Clearness is a noun or an adjective noun, but it's definitely not a verb, and that's the way they do things. This is why it is such nonsense. Okay, and the last one, H2893, cleansing 7 times, purifying 3 times, purification. There it is. Purifying's verb, cleansing's verb, purification is a noun, it's 2 times. Cleansed is an adjective, 1 time. I'm not making this up. This is directly from Strong's. It's insane. So in here, when we get to the possible modern cognates, Anglo-Saxon, I use that Saxon T in my text. And as I said, it almost looks a bit like a P because they put that circle sort of to one side. Yeah, I guess it depends a little bit on what source you see this in as far as how much it might vary a little bit. Some that make the circle in it much bigger, you can see how closely related it is to the current OBRY T that I am using. Again, all of the glyphs that I've put together in the OBRY alphabet basically came from all of the artifacts I could find images of, as well as everything claimed to be Paleo-Hebrew in all of the older references that I have, and that's like Encyclopedia Judaica, Jewish Encyclopedia. There are a few others concerning language that have bits and pieces. So that, which actually is not that far off or different than the Greek theta. And again, depending on how they make this Saxon T, not too different from that either. So in Anglo-Saxon, we have dur with the D because of that shift. Hold on in time, like endure. We have thur, thorough, thorough, or through. Complete careful, or perfect. And we're seeing some words we recognize. Pure, because of a shift from the to de to pe. Because anything in a D can be shifted to P. Anything that is TH can be shifted to D. So that's why I entered pure, being unmixed or uniform. We have thuru, a door. Think about that. Thuru is a door. Thuru. And thura, with the H at the end, a canal, or what? Thoroughfare. Thoroughfare. Gaelic, tour, complete or whole. Sounds like tour. Tour, complete or whole. And we have fior. Why do we have fior? Well, because anything that's TH can be D. Anything that is D can be P. Anything that is P can be F. I'm not making this up. Fior. True, veritable. Maybe. In German, we have teuer, T-E-U-E-R, expensive. We have Thur, T-H-U-R, as a door again. We have dar, D-A-R-R, as cure or kiln dry. To kiln dry or to cure, dar. And tier, T-I-E-R, wild beast. Now, Proto-Indo-European or Latin Greek, dear, which is D-H-E-U-R, to ruin by deceit. Tear as a prefix, tremble, feeble, rub, transgress. Theurgy, a work from a god. And then another ther prefix as beast. Now, that is just a crazy mix. And I will have to attest that this particular word study, and because it was based on a word that or a root that began with a vowel, and because the cognates that there were in OBRY for this had so many similar phonetics that could be crossed over so easily in more modern resources. This was such a nightmare. And at this point in time, again, I'm trying to attest, hey, these entries, they could be crossovers. I really did my best to try to limit those crossovers. But boy, oh boy, at this point in time, I don't know how much they can be eliminated. I think the only way we can do that is by getting as close as we can to any of these given entries, and then perhaps go back through and start eliminating what are crossovers and should be categorized with other OBRY roots, if at all. So the notes. This is a little bit repetitive, but just to drive it home. In the above examples, the intermittent middle affixed U or vav may have some effect on the meaning of the word, but based on context, not enough to change its meaning. The U could also frequently be matres lectiones, the seemingly arbitrary insertion of vowels to, in quotes, aid pronunciation. That's the official story. The OBRY the is found in words such as yither, to stretch or turn, thub, good, thur, a row, and many other words which may or may not indicate order or purity. It appears many times in words such as thema, being unclean or defiled, as in translated as unclean or defiled, but also many times in thub, translated as good, as mentioned, and bathach, trust or safety. Because of the few entries of this T compared to other OBRY glyphs, we will need to rely a great deal on the possible modern cognates found. And what is found first is the so-called Saxon T. Pronounced TH, looks kind of like a P. That's the other reason why pure ended up in there too, is because oftentimes, as strange as it is, if a letter is presented in a specific way in older references, it can sometimes, I don't know how, it just boggles my mind. You will see a word with, say, the Saxon T, or there's actually a Saxon W that looks a bit like this too. And you might find a shift from those letters, which looked kind of like in some cases, it might look like a P. In other cases, that Saxon W might look sort of like a D or a P. And then in other reference works, you might find those words that had those, what they call specifically Saxon letters, now with our sort of modern letters on them instead, which don't bear enough of a resemblance or similarity to do something like that, or to justify something like that, but it happens. That's the other reason why I included pure up above. So I went on, if the word was once zaire and became pure, this wouldn't be surprising, especially when one witnesses the often bizarre and seemingly inexplicable changes which I just went through. There are a number of words that make a cosmetic shift between similar looking letters. And now I'm going to cover the fior, which may well began its life as theor or pior or sire. It could have started in any of those ways and then went to fior. The German B and V, for instance, they're so similar looking that it wouldn't be too difficult to see one word in the B's in one edition of the dictionary, and then see the same word in the V's in the next edition. That's how close these German B's and V's look, especially because if you get a German reference dictionary, you're going to have to learn just what the letters look like because they're so freaking bizarre looking. And it takes some time. And they're just bizarre and similar looking, you know? The K might look like the R, the E might look like the C, the B and the V definitely look alike, which really raises a lot of questions. When we talk about, like, they'll say, well, you know, a lot of those Masoretic Vavs end up B's later on, and that this is a Jewish thing. Well, is it? Or is it the fact that in some of these languages, like specifically German, that the U and the B are so similar looking that so oftentimes words that would begin with a U sound were shifted over very smoothly between references from the U to the B or vice versa. It's crazy. So this is the reason for pure or dur being up top. So there seems to be more textual evidence for something nearer to pure or thorough than clean, as it's used in context of beasts. So like thair or deer in Gaelic, referring to a great beast, as this may have been a way to express a thoroughbred beast. Not a great beast or any beast, but one who was thoroughbred. There's got to be some reason why thorough was added to bread, as in clean or pure bread. That might be the reason that these sorts of words are rendered as beast or some kind of beast in these old references. But the real breakthrough words above have to do with either something of one and the same substance all the way through, as in the word through, or thorough, which could be considered enduring, as one needs to endure to get through, and I have to fix this as I go sometimes. One needs to endure to get through, both similar words, related words, to get through a thing, to pass through thoroughly. This is possibly how door developed from thur, or thoroughfare from through, canal. Can't make this stuff up. Or can you? But if you can, I didn't make it up. I'm reporting on the facts. So below, if we see the ordered, maybe placed, and the area gap, in the physical aspect, it could be entirely through, or in the temporal, finished, consistency, an unmixed purity. All right, and if we go and we look at, so take the big examples. We have two big examples, one being H2889. So let's look at just a couple of examples of that with this idea that we now have of this more like thorough, in the sense of pure. I mean, thorough and pure, but we have to understand they're not used exactly the same way today. But let's think about that. If it's in a physical aspect, maybe entirely through. Sometimes people would actually consider that clean. If you were entirely through something, you came out clean. But also temporal, finished, or a consistency, an unmixed purity. So like the first example, Genesis 7:2, of every clean beast. Clean, that's the theor. Exodus 25:11, thou shalt overlay it with pure gold, thorough, like a thoroughbred. So this is in the form of an adjective. So if we can find an example that is closer, 2891. Maybe to a verb. We'll see. Well, Genesis 35:2, Jacob said to his household and to all that were with him, put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. Be clean, like to go entirely through, pass through, clean on the other side. Unmixed purity. So it works. Does it always work in the way that they are wanting to express it to us in the Old Testament? The contexts they want to put it in? Maybe not. But the nice thing is when you see this word ther, it might be a good idea to absolutely think of thorough or through as being a very, very close modern cognate. Now here we go with a real interesting one. This is yitzer, and it's Strong's H3323. It's translated 22 times as oil, 1 time as anointed, straight into the possible modern cognates. Est, being to estimate or look ahead. Easter. What? Easter? Easter. Either the goddess of fertility or a spring feast. Spring feast, Easter. Now, some may notice that the consonants here for Easter have the S before the T, Easter. But if we look at our word, this glyph here, tsa, has the T before the S. That is true. However, There are many, many examples of that being switched from tsa to ts. They're very similar. There's a slight difference, and there is sometimes that shift between tsa and st. It's really hard to say S and T together fast unless you put it in a context. Easter, yitzer. Very close. Eastern, in the east, forward. We have esser, which is the AE letter, CER. Esser, a field, land, a thing sown, and ekir, an ear of corn. Now in Gaelic we have eisir, E-I-S-I-R, oyster, go figure. We have eisir, passage or path. We have this eis, Eric, rise again. Dun dun dun. Who knows? In German, we have the prefix zaire to do with pieces of. We have seher, a seer. We have schur, S-C-H-U-R, fleece. I don't know. See, there's such crossover. Tsa is one of those words that can end up in C, in Z, in SHC, like in German. So anyways, in Proto-Indo-European plus Latin and Greek, we have ser, to flow, suer, speak, hiss, a stake, a wound, to weigh. That's a lot there. Now the notes. Based on glyphs alone, the modern time and purpose of Easter seems a reasonable possible modern cognate, though how it came to be a holiday / holy day is unknown. This apparently was and is a spring feast, often equated with Pesach or Passover as to its timing. It certainly could have been used as a hope of good fruits for the year ahead. And as it almost always appears in context with other apparent agricultural words, like corn and wine, which may or may not be corn or wine, they all seem to have to do with the expectation of harvest. We see air, space or area, plus that yitz at the front going forward, because what it has is the Y, which always tends to indicate action or maybe masculine action, and the tsa, which almost always indicates a going, a growing, a growth, something. So, and from that time of the year, the land commences to grow or go forth. Yitzer, the going forth of an area, the growing of. Yitzer. We also see this going forward in land or time concept in est, to estimate, eis erik, to rise again, or ser, to flow. The admittedly difficult problem with this entry, along with zaire and ser, is the tendency to find any of these consonants dispersed among the various letters in Saxon, Gaelic, Germanic, Pi, etc. dictionaries. As stated earlier, and it can't be overstated because it's just such a difficult phenomenon to deal with. Z, S, Sha, or Tsa can end up as C, S, or Z, or various combinations of these kinds of letters. If these letters exist in their respective reference alphabets, again, if they're even there. That's why I said that the section in the Gaelic dictionary on C is enormous. It's enormous. Often, all of these OBRY S phonetic glyphs can end up in one letter like C in Gaelic. The bottom line is that we do find words relating to geographical and temporal or conceptual space here. The yitzer is found nearly always in context with other crops or products of yearly work and growth. Corn, oil, and wine. The oil part is the yitzer, okay? Whether all terms are or are not accurate, still, and it's like always, we're always going to find it in context, and the thing is whether or not they're accurate. The context is always basically looking forward to a good harvest. That's the big deal, you know? Someone who is agrarian, their livelihood, their whether or not they can be seen as having wealth has so much to do with what they can harvest, what fruit they bring in from either their herding or their growing, whether they have orchards or fields, flocks and herds. So the context of those passages, 20-something passages, always has to do with hopeful expectation of the land. And not just the land, I mean the land, the weather, all the conditions, right? And I guess one could see how it would become a very wrong-headed tradition to, in a sense, you can say worship or not worship or whatever, the idea of a good harvest. The problem is we tend to want to, and we do this with the God of the Bible. We want to turn him into some sort of genie to grant our requests. That's why people pray for the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. You damn well know that they do. This is a common practice in Christianity. They completely ignore this idea of vain repetition. You know, the non-charismatics want to say, that's just the charismatics and their blah, 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 blah. But that's, no. Vain repetition. Stop repeating yourself. If you prayed for something once and you believe that Yahweh or God, if you want to use that term, though I don't understand what it means, if you want to believe that he can hear you when you pray, that he can read your thoughts. You know, you have to pray out loud, right? You can read your thoughts. And you expressed yourself a great desire or something one time. He heard you. If it doesn't come to pass, it's not because he didn't hear you. So shut up. Now, for real, shut up. Why are you being so damned persistent? Do you think he didn't hear you? And if you think that he didn't care enough to pay attention the first time, why do you keep asking? He probably doesn't care enough to pay attention to the 100th time you ask. Fuck's sakes. And I'm not saying that like I'm not guilty of doing it. I've been guilty of doing it. And I'm not necessarily saying that like people shouldn't have some kind of active prayer life, but honest to God, I don't know, because I read the Bible and I pay attention. And most of the characters like that we laud, like these are good examples of ways that we should behave or act. They're not spending all their time praying and certainly not asking for shit all the time. Shut up! Give it a rest! No shit you need things. No shit you want things. If it's that important, express it. And look, it's not like you can't express, your deep, longing feelings to this great sovereign we have. Nobody's saying that. But stop repeating yourself. Do any of you realize how annoying it is when somebody does that to you? They told you one time that they wanted something, needed something. You say a child or a spouse. See, it should be the wife who's asking from the husband. But, you know, in our modern world, and everything is flipped upside down. So you get asked for something once. I'll think about it. And you're not done thinking about it because you're not even sure that it's a good idea, that you want to do it. And you're kind of putting that thought in the back of your head because it's not that important. They ask again. You say, I said I'd think about it, and I haven't decided. And so they go about this strategy of sort of bringing it up. Like, hey, I'm not asking again. Wait, I'm not asking. I was just saying something like it was, you know, something else. And you know that's not the case. It's like they're passively aggressively still asking you the damn question. You know how irritating that is, right? So why would you do that to our great sovereign and creator? Shut up. He heard you. Now, if something continues to be terrifically awful after you've asked, I can't make judgments on that as far as going to him again. Sometimes people in the Bible have had to do that because they were in such dire need or distress. And I think he understands that. But in general, far too many people, especially Christians, won't shut the hell up. All right, you said it. Thanks. Shut up. Oh, you want so-and-so to get that new job? Don't ask me every day. Twice a day. And I know I used a pronoun putting myself in the place of Yahweh. I'm expressing it as if, let's say, it was my decision. That's what I would say. Stop asking every day, 2-3 times a day. But this is basically why we generate these idols. Because we're basically creating something that we can whine and piss and moan to, something that is going to be our little genie, and we would do anything for them if that were the case. You know, most people would. Most people, if they found something that had some kind of power and could grant them certain things, they'd do anything to please or appease that thing. It's not a great mystery why people make up these gods, idols, or even just concepts like a good harvest, which grants them, in a sense, it grants them wealth and power. Okay? So my breakdown at the end, why, the yod, why, denoting action, plus the tza, denoting growth, plus the air, area, or gap in time. So in the physical aspect, crops of the area. Temporal aspect, harvest in time. And next one, mare or mare. One of my least favorites, by the way. It shows up a lot. And I am going to start with a disclaimer. I can't be absolutely positive, just like with any of this, that my conclusions are on. The problem is there's also mare, just M-R, which is also a word that appears many times. And unfortunately, there could be, because we have a vowel here, and it could be mare or mere, they're so close. They're just so close that some of these possible modern cognates maybe don't have much to do with mare, and maybe have more to do with just mere, M-R. So that's the disclaimer to keep in mind. So we have mare H4116, translated as haste 42 times, swift 3 times, quickly 3 times, hastily twice, hasty twice, soon twice, speed twice, headlong once, rash once, as in rash, hasty, fearful once, ready once, shortly once, speedily once, straightaway once, suddenly once. Yes. Now we have mare H4117, translated endow once and surely once. Then we have 4118, quickly 8 times, speedily 4 times, hastily 3 times, soon once, suddenly once, and at once, once. H4119, dowry, yes, dowry, as in what you would pay for marriage. Going back to that, 3 times. And then H4120, quickly 10 times, speedily 4, make speed once, soon once, swiftly once, hastily, with speed, and shortly all once. So we get the gist of how they're typically translating this mare. Of course, one of the problems that we're going to find in the text is that when we see H2022, air, which is translated as mountain, and we see an M in front of that, mare, that's going to be translated from or away from the mountain. So the possible modern cognates, Anglo-Saxon, mare, great fame or noble, mar/mara, more, mere or mire, lake or sea, mere with the little accent mark over the first E, excellent, mere, M-E-A-R, a field, mere, M-E-R-E, a boundary line, like a mere stone, merry, as in brisk, marin or mirin, to hinder, moor, fen or bog, Gaelic, mayor, alive, mare, loose or at liberty, and mayor or mahir with the H aspirant there, wanton, suddenly or quick, mir, M-I-R, piece or fragment, German, mar, M-A-H-R, news or tidings, mere, straight or narrow sea, mere, mehir, augment, multiply, or more. We have that idea of more. And I just think that's probably very different when we get into the more. But, you know, we do see that air suffix from earlier that actually implies a greater amount. This one's such a kind of a toughie. So we do have in Proto-Indo-European plus Latin Greek, we do have mare as a prefix, like get a share or merit. We have mere as pure, absolute, or boundary mark. Moor, M-O-O-R, open, uncultivated ground. Mayor or more, greater. Mayor or mere, as in mid. More, again, a fen, large collection of fresh water, or more, to do with water. So these possible modern cognates, kind of all over the place. And again, this is definitely one of those words that I could really see a number of different OBRY roots and combinations that would have that M, because M is a really common prefix on basic OBRY biglyph roots. It's really common. So it's a toughie. In my notes, with a general absence of a ubiquitous MN or NM shift, which may well exist. It happens. We see it a ton at the end of a lot of words. Not as much at the beginning. Only very little do we see it at the beginning. It's there, but we only see it very little. There simply isn't time to pursue in this context. The most obvious characteristics here seem to be pointing towards the OBRY M acting as not only a going away from in a geographical term, but perhaps a reduction of in temporal or conceptual terms. Now, this is tricky. It's really tricky when we get into conceptual or temporal terms. On the one hand, and I'm going to say this before I continue with my notes, the text of my notes. On the one hand, it seems like it could be a reduction, like as in minus, to take away from. But on the other hand, it does seem like it basically, well, again, reduction, but reducing to one. If you have a concept, I don't know, let's just say, well, ackle, fuel or food, and then you put an M at the front, ackle. That should be essentially reduction to a singular sort of instance of that. Really weird, but that's exactly how it appears to behave. So now, with my notes, this means that just as mare means from air, like if we're going to say, you know, from a mountain in a special passage, mare in a temporal spatial passage. Mare in a temporal passage may likely mean quickly or briskly. Why? Because if air is a dilation of time or space, and we reduce that, we have something that is an instance, perhaps. Now, this may serve as a verb as it's listed as a verb, but I find it works more as an adverb unless specifically appearing as an obvious verb. So like mare with that Y at the front, make haste, or mare, she hurried. And as has been seen elsewhere, acts in nearly the opposite capacity at the beginning than at the end of the word. So we have, like, for instance, deber could be the matter versus debere, the matter but softer, or the feminine matter. The acts differently at the front than it does at the end. M likely behaves similarly. By the way, I got an adolescent Rottweiler's going crazy here. Can't do nothing about it. He gets wound up when he gets wound up. That's all there is to it. So, continuing, it appears overwhelmingly apparent that M serves as a plural at the end of a word. So, erim, mountains, question mark, or areas. So, assuming it may act as a reducer in the front, not a plural, but a reducer or singular at the front, from the mount as well, to go away from elapsed time, it's not out of the question to add here at the end, but to reduce at the beginning. It is true that often the M appears with a preemptive Y, as just seen, and though it's unknown how or if these two may be connected, so like at the end, YM, they want to say that's a masculine plural, both the Y and the M, but a lot of times you'll find words with just an M that they pluralize as well. You'll find words with a Y they pluralize because they'll say it's in the construct state, which we get into later on. As M does appear alone in plurals, it's still safe to make this assertion. Therefore, just as mare can be understood spatially in above possible cognates like mare, a field, and mir, a boundary line, it can also be understood as found in words such as mare, quick, or even mercury, quicksilver, and merry. Not marry as in get married, merry as in lively. What did I put? Brisk. Lively or brisk. Now, one final thought. While forms of M blank R or C, so we're going to see that a lot in Latin-based languages. this idea of mare as C, mar as C, mara as C. Although these are included, these may or may not come from this root, as in either mare boundary being the C, maybe, or mare quick, i.e. liquid, but it may also come from maretz, from the land. That mar, how we get mar, mara, as the Latin dictionaries claim, mara, sea, is from Celtic or Gaelic, and many forms of M, blank, R, fill in an E, A, whatever, occur, especially earlier forms with an S or a C at the end, as in merce, or merchant, or marsh. That's why I put in that ma'aretz, because earlier forms we see it like merce, merchant, marsh. As there is currently no hard proof for either forms of M blank R, will remain in this table just for at least the present time. So if we have M being a reduction or away from at the beginning, plus air, an area / gap, geo or temp, in the physical, it can be denoting from an area. And we always have to consider that possibility when we see mare in the text, whether they're telling us that it's one of these mare or not. It could possibly be referring to physically going away from an air, a space, or area. Now in the temporal, lesser time, a small thing, quick or brisk, perhaps. And that's mare. And boy, was that unfun. A lot of these. And that's the other thing too. If we're looking at a basic biglyph root that starts with a vowel, there's going to be all kinds of OBRY cognates that have a consonant before that. And that is going to give us far too many options when we start looking at these possible modern cognates. Really, just so many. Okay, so now we get into nair. Now this one's really interesting because it has so much to do with one of the chapters that I just completed. At least not the rough draft, but something close to a final draft. For volume 1 of the Bible versus Middle East, I covered the nair of Eden, what they say are rivers. I covered that. So this is important, this nair. Now, the thing is, in the Rivers of Eden chapter, I avoided going into the linguistic aspects of it there. I thought it would just be laying on far, far too much at once. So I basically went with really the hydrological, the geological, just the common sense and what works and what doesn't. But we're going to see how this nair that's supposed to be a river, and it's supposed to be like the 5 nair of Eden. There's 5. Because in Genesis 2:10 it says 1 proceeded from to water the garden, and then it became 4 heads from there. So it's 5. And of course the translators, the gods of language, call them rivers. But let's look at this. So nair H5102, translated flow together 3 times, flow 2 times, and lightened 1 time. Nair H5104 is translated river 98 times, flood 18 times, streams twice. It's translated as Aram Neharaim, so with the word Aram. With the word Aram, which is basically a nation that was near Canaan, and they just put it together with that 1 time. Riverside 1 time. And there's a reason why they do that, by the way. Now, I don't get into that in volume 1 of the Bible versus Middle East, but I will get into that as time goes on. So we have nair with the E at the end, H5105, is translated as light 1 time. And then we have this real oddball one, mare. We got the M at the front, interestingly, right? And then the E at the end. Mare. It's translated one time as den. Yeah. Den. Possible modern cognates. Anglo-Saxon, nair, were or not. Near, N-E-R-E, refuge or safety. Narrow, a channel of water. Near, nigh or close. Gaelic, nar, in the midst. Near, water or a river. German, nachren, nourish. Neritic, pertaining to inhabitants of the sea. Neritic. Now, Proto-Indo-European or Latin Greek, the now or nav or norm having to do with naval, ship, or shipping. Nereid, a sea nymph. Or, I also included nourish or nurse, to feed or to fill. To feed or to fill. So in my notes, as all the above language references are heavily influenced by Latin, and Latin appears heavily influenced by Greek, the majority of N prefixes in the possible modern cognate references indicate a negative. There's a lot of them that do, because the N in Latin and Greek is oftentimes going to indicate something negative. I can't explain why this is, however. We don't see a negative associated with the OBRY N, but often the opposite of Latin in the sense of movement, flowing, or filling. So we have like na in OBRY, to beseech or to pray, not repetitively. We have ane, befall. We have onen, a cloud. How about natan, to give? The OBRY N has many signs of moving or flowing. However, unlike nechel, a river, nair doesn't seem to be a river, but a lake or large body of flowing water as opposed to a pond or a solitary lake. An impoundment lake of a dam would qualify, as would a natural lake made by a geotopo pinch at one end of a river with a large area of lowlands for a mass of water to settle in, though still flowing. We see that plenty just in nature. Or the Great Lakes, which all seem to begin with superior and are all fed by springs and rivers and seem to flow one after the other until they empty into the Hudson or St. Lawrence and the Atlantic. Either way, it can be observed, based on the use of the OBRY N, how nair fits into the air family. And by the way, regarding that claim that I just made, that superior is all fed by springs. Now, the hydrologists, the geologists, they're going to tell you things like, well, Superior has this huge area of watershed, all these various little rivers and creeks that contribute to it. But Superior also has an average depth around 400 feet. They say it goes up to about 1,333 feet. Never freezes at the bottom, almost never freezes over at the top. Funny thing about springs, right at the source of a spring, they're almost always just above freezing. And if they're constantly flowing, you're not going to get a freezing, and they don't freeze. They're just above freezing, they're very cold, but just above freezing, and they're constantly moving. So yeah, I mean, while Superior might have contribution by a number of these creeks or streams, not any really big rivers, those are still all typically spring fed. There's uncounted thousands and thousands and thousands of springs all around the Great Lakes. It's insane how much fresh water just comes right out of the ground. And I've been to springs that come right out of the ground that lakes are on top of, like Kitchita-Kippy. It's so clear you can see the springs down below. The water's just constantly just bursting forth 50 feet below you or more, because it's so hard to gauge the depth. I think they say it's about 50 feet. So back to my notes. So H5102 nair in context seems to denote to fill, like the end of the flow, as opposed to flow by itself, like flow alone. The contexts this is found within appear to dictate the filling of a space-time. So, example, Isaiah 2:2, ... and all nations shall flow unto / fill Neru it. See, the flow part may be appropriate, but not without the idea of filling, as the verse in question uses air twice before this end clause. So there is an area to be filled, not simply flowed to. It has to be flowed to and filled. H5104 nair appears with H5158 Nahal river in the same verse, Isaiah 27:12, from the channel of the river, which is H5104, unto the stream, which is H5158, that Nahal of Egypt. But they're both translated river. They're both translated as river. That can't be. You would only need to use one of those words. See, this should not happen if both words are river. If so, it ought to read from Nahal to Nahal, or from nair to nair. These are different things. Also, Jonah 2:3 reads, for thou hast cast me into the deep in the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed me about. All thy billows and all thy waves passed over me. The portion in question is Ba'labab Yamim U Nair Yi Sababni, or in the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed me about. The semicolon was added by translators. The actual text reads, seas and nair. So, river? It's a singular. It's singular. Nair. River? If in reality Yamim, seas, are greater than nair, river, why is nair, river, in the singular, and yem, seas, in the plural? It should read, seas and river compassed me about. Or if we apply a new clause at the you, because typically that you at the beginning of the word can oftentimes mean a new clause or an addition to the thought. We have to sort that out based on context. If we add a break where we see that you, which is before the nair, it would be in the heart of seas and flow area, lake, compassed me about. Now, why am I going on so much about this point? Because we need to understand something. If nair was a river, it would hardly fit with the idea of air being a protracted expression of space, either geographically or temporally. If it were a lake, it absolutely would. The point being, as opposed to a long, thin, relative to its length, flow, nair appears to be different than Nahal, river, and comparative to Yam, sea. And a great area filled with flowing water would likely be what we currently call a lake, or sometimes a sea if it's saline, but not always. We do see water references in narrows, near, neritic, and in the pi we have that now, nav, norm, and nereid. So there's modern cognates in support of nair as a body of water and not as a stream of water. We also see forms of near alluding to the possibility that the idea of flowing into an area and to fill in or fill a space. Something is near. It's coming. It's flowing here. It's close. Nair. It's near. This may once have been akin to near we know today. The end is near. See, I think the way I wrote this a while ago, and I'm thinking ahead of it. So when I get to the end here, and by the way, I address this in mare and not nair. But just to repeat, there is the possibility of the NM shift applying here. So if they say that mare as a C in Latin comes from Gaelic, then it's possible that there was an NM shift that took place at some point, and it was originally nair and became mare. It's possible. So N, to flow, from, to, plus air, area gap. In the physical aspect, a flowing area, not just a flow, flowing area, lake or sea. And in the temporal, to fill time close to a space of time. All right, so we're getting near the end of our OBRY cognates. We have a couple entries left. The next one is zaire, or zaire, S-E-R. It's translated once as round, but it's translated 8 times in entry H5470 as prison. Now, this one was fascinating, as many of these were, because, you know, one of the reasons why I had released this first part a long time ago, now I have to delete that and release this in its stead, was the exaggerated amount of time that I ended up spending in old Gaelic and Germanic and Anglo-Saxon references, basically dictionaries. But this one, along with what we looked at earlier, zaire, and the possibility of it being something like to certify, to back up, or to strengthen, it gets really interesting when we see some of these things and how they may have been used, because one of the things I think that it is safe to assume, or maybe that it's responsible for us to assume, is that so the language used in the OBRY portions of the scripture, so, you know, what we would call the Old Testament, as opposed to the language that would be used in a sense like the commonplace language. How would OBRY be used by not only just like common people who weren't focused on not just hagiography, or, you know, that's just the term that's frequently applied to what they would call spiritual or religious literature. And I hate to call the Bible that. It's just that that's where it's going to be classified. Though I would absolutely call it spiritual literature, in the sense that I think there's so much evidence of the common repetitive voice throughout all of those books, that I view this this concept of inspiration very seriously. And the reason is this: for one thing, there is other literature out there that's claimed to be hagiography, Hebrew literature, spiritual Hebrew literature, literature having to do with this same, the same people, the same subject matters, the same aliyim, God, or ale, or al, God, since it appears in these different forms. But they don't, you can read through them. You take the book of Enoch, take the book of Jasher, any of the apocryphal books, Judith, Tobit, the Maccabees series, Wisdom, any of the, and also Esdras, which is supposed to be more works produced by Ezra, except under that Koine Greek transliteration as Esdras. You take all of that literature and you just spend a little bit of time in it. And if you're really familiar with the literature and how it's presented and how it sounds and the voice that's used, whether it's a third person or, like in the case of Jeremiah and Isaiah and other prophets, it's very much oftentimes first person. There's still that consistency of voice. When there's the, thus saith Yahweh, there is an absolute tight consistency. And I don't think that anyone who is faking literature that should be part of this whole group or set can achieve the goals that they want to achieve, which is making us believe in certain things that the text that we already have, that we call the Old Testament, doesn't tend to make us believe in. I think that's often the goal of these various texts that I find very untrustworthy and also don't have the same voice. So what I'm getting at with that is, we see not only this consistency of voice throughout those, just the 39 books that we currently have, as our Old Testament canon. And of course, that does include Esther and Song of Songs, though I know I've repeated it many times. I don't know if I think they should be included in that canon or not, okay? Esther is the one I'm super, super unsure about. Song of Songs, I'm not really sure what the great purpose of it is, to be honest. But the thing is, so I think we do have to assume that there is quite possibly one sort of, not necessarily lexicon, but maybe that sort of word, a set of terminologies, a way of speaking and expressing things within the context of those books, which I would say are sacred, meaning different, set apart, not common. And if we see them as sacred, set apart, not common, then it's perfectly reasonable for us to see quite possibly what all of the common people who were herding and growing grains, and once Israel started becoming an empire, there would have been merchants and shopkeepers and sailors and other things, as we would see in a culture that was engaging in commerce and all sorts of other things, carpenters, of course, and keep going, etc., etc. Okay? I don't think a lot of the language and terminology that we see in this set of books, which are sacred, are always what we're going to see from the common person. Even in the books that I write or the articles, whatever it is that I'm writing, I approach the subject, unless we're talking about the subjects of those in charge today and their lies, or those people who love their lies and love the world and want to perpetuate it as it is. With them, I have very little to no respect. But if I'm writing about topics having to do with the Bible or other weighty, truthful matters, even the tone that I'll take is quite different than the tone that I'm going to take just commonly. If I'm just commonly talking to someone who I'm used to or comfortable with, it's going to be very different. So I think we have to allow for that when we start looking at these possible modern cognates as they occur in Gaelic, and I know a certain amount of that has been changed deliberately with splashes of Latin, Greek, and a whole lot of unnecessary added vowels, just like we see in the Mizora and the Nakud, the vowel points in Hebrew as opposed to OBRY. Same thing with German. So much is unnecessarily exaggerated. There's so many words that are spread apart. But when we get into things that are like combined words, where we see that there may be multiple roots here coming from OBRY, but of course we could never find a word like that in the Bible, not in that way, like these compound words and forms of words that we might not find in the Old Testament. I think we have to allow for the fact that the common speech was likely quite different than the sacred speech. Not to completely, for instance, these people who are very stuck on King James and everything they quote about the Bible has to be King James because they find that to be proper, more holy or sacred language. And I'm not discounting when something should be a certain sort of language that shows respect for the material or the issues at hand or the author and inspirer of. But what I'm saying is there could be a lot regarding the speech of the people that was different. And that's the people during the time period that those books of the Old Testament were being written. That's not counting how much the language might have changed, as, for instance, they just separated one from another. We see that, of course, in Judges 12 with the shibboleth thing. But, as they were cast away, as the Gel or the Gaels ended up in foreign lands and were experiencing new things, were often having to experience learning different languages. Even when they held on to their old language, there could have been a lot of changes that had to happen simply because of different concepts that were introduced into their mind. And they still may have used the same language to express these different concepts. Therefore, we might see very different words with very similar roots that we can find in the Old Testament. So with zaire or ser, the possible modern cognates, Anglo-Saxon, perhaps seer, C-E-A-R, anxious or grievous. Maybe sirs eern or quert or swert eern, prison. Remember, 8 times is prison. We have sior, bondman, quite close. We have ser, which is also spelled 2 other different ways, so I'm not going to spell it, sier. A turn, which that might be related to another one of these air cognates. We have eser, an acre. Again, that might
be related to another one of the cognates, but there's often so much overlap because of phonetic shifts and vowel shifts. We have ser like S-E-R, also spelled ser with an I or sire. What is that? Master. Now that is interesting because if we were talking about a prison situation, we could perhaps see how that, because everybody's familiar with sir or sire, how that might have come about in our relatively modern culture. We have swern or quern, because it's hard to tell if they're using this as a C or a K. In Anglo-Saxon, in Gaelic, and German, and the dictionaries don't always say. And this swern or quern is a mill, and I think it would be swern, a mill. We have sar, S-A-R, a wound or sore. Surround, surround. What is that? Confine on all sides. So it's a verb. Interesting though. Surround, confine on all sides. All right, now Gaelic. We have aesir, angry or cruel. Car, twist, bend, or turn. We have car again, during, for, near, about, in reference to time. In reference to time. Seor, hurt or harm. Sear, to seal with wax, to seal, sear. We have sar with the accent over the A, sar, which is a stoppage or a hindrance. And we seem to be going back to the idea of prison. Maybe round in the sense of confined. We also see ia sirt with a little hyphen in the middle, ia sirt, unjust. We see seor or sir as continual or ever. That's interesting. Now, German, we only have a couple. We have, in German, Carcer, prison. Carcer, prison. Now, I'm sure you're starting to see where this could be going in our own time. We also have cur, C-U-R, under care, or in the care of. Cur, which becomes, of course, care, or cure, which I think actually had a very different meaning probably a century ago to today. Now we do have some Proto-Indo-European Latin Greek, circ, S-E-R-K, to hedge or fence. Similar to our ideas above. We have ser, S-E-R, to flow. I don't know if that might have something more to do with another entry. We have ser, S-E-R, to guard or watch over. Okay. S-E-R again, ser, put together or bind. We have S-E-I-C-A if it was a silent R, and sometimes you do have to account for that, which would be bind or strap. We have suer, speak, hiss, a stake or wound or weigh. Scare, which could have started out with the C there, scare or ser, turn, bend. And then we have circle or circus, a ring, or to form a ring around. Now regarding the notes, there isn't enough strong contextual proof for H5469, which was the one entry that was defined as or used as the word round. It's in Song of Songs, of all books. Whenever we have singular entries that tend to end up in Esther or Song of Songs, I quickly become not entirely suspicious, but I don't give it a whole lot of weight as far as how organic it is or whether or not I should take that one entry very seriously, unless it agrees with a number of other entries of words spelled exactly the same way. Then maybe. So it's in Song of Songs, used to describe the round quality of an apparent navel, because the word they use as navel is also, it's somewhat of a minority term. However, H5470 is found entirely in the context entirely of Joseph in Mitzrayim after the incident with Potiphar's wife, and it fits fairly well. If you read all of the surrounding text, he certainly does seem to be confined. He's not coming and going as he pleases. And then later on, we see this Paroah, or Pharaoh's butler and either chef or baker, who end up in there as well. Probably because somebody in Paroah's house was poisoned. Or maybe the old man Paroah was actually poisoned somehow or died somehow, and they were sorting out how exactly it was that he died. And this is why Joseph, not long after all this, is brought before the current Paroah, who had had those very alarming dreams. And he is, because he gave the interpretation, he's elevated in the way that he is. Remember, when he's brought before Paroah, Joseph is only 30 by that point in time. He'd been in Mitzrayim for about 13 years, probably in prison for about 10 years. But he's brought before him, he gives the interpretation of the dream, and then later, when he's speaking to his brothers and his fathers as Joseph, instead of the whatever you would call him, the number 2 man in Mitzrayim, he tells him that Yahweh has made me like a father to Paroah. So it's likely a young one, and it is likely that this butler and this chef or baker were in prison because the old one, likely Paroah's father, the young Paroah, died, possibly of poisoning, and they were sorting out who did it. And maybe it was that baker or chef, and that's why he was executed. Now, that was inserted by me after the fact, but I will continue with my notes. Considering the overwhelming amount of CIR, like CIR/SCR variation roots in all above languages, this one seems like a close to accurate rendering. The OBRY S is seen in words such as sabab or sab, which is rendered turn about or compass. It's seen in naso, depart or journey. It's seen in sur, to take away, and asap, to gather. And much of the S-accented words, the S possible modern cognate words, and S itself, along with C and its possible modern cognate equivalent, the Greek sigma, and even the Masoretic Samic, imply something curved. They all do. And we're supposed to look at them, the S, the C, the Greek sigma, which looks very much like the OBRY Samic. It also looks very much like a C if we just got rid of the last little swoop up to the top tail. And like I said, the Masoretic Samic, looks, they're all curved. They seem to imply something curved or curving. And new information suggests the OBRY S may have been curved as well, like a C or an S. This odd telephone pole was really what I could dig up in most of the reference materials that I found when trying to put this font together. The spatial/geographical aspect isn't hard to see here, as a surrounded area, like the Circe Aaron, or surround, or sar, or carcer. But the temporal/conceptual aspect is more difficult unless we understand it as some sort of confinement, though it's not apparent how that might be expressed. See, car, or the cure or care, being in reference to time and likely repetition, might help to begin to understand this temporarily or conceptually, but doesn't appear to answer how exactly this would work. We might see both car, during, or turn, reference time, and ser, S-E-R or C-E-R, confine, imprison, together in incarcerate. Or as stated in the zaire table, this could be both zaire, the one we're looking at, and zaire, what we looked at earlier, for the zaire being surround and the zaire being to reinforce or certify together. In car, zaire, 8. And you can explain the in and the 8 as, you could say, Greco-Latin prefixes and suffixes. The rendering of prison for H5470 and the fact that it always occurs with bit or house, bit e ser, house, the confine, appears appropriate. So here we see the S as something implying a turn or curve, plus the air, area, gap in the geotemp aspect. So in the physical sense, a place of course correction or change, and in the temporal sense, to circumvent or to curve off normal course, perhaps to distract even. Perhaps cure, because that would be getting you off your current course. If you were sick, or if you were ill, or they said you were sick or ill, or there was something wrong with you, or you were just on a course that was regarded as a course you didn't want to be on, or somebody else didn't want you to be on. That could be applied as well. So now we come to our last entry. This is to dare, to dare. That's Strong's H8410, and it only appears twice. It appears one time as pine and one time as pine tree. So to dare might relate back to a previous entry we saw, the dare. But let's just go right into the possible modern cognates. Anglo-Saxon. Dotter, to rattle. Tatter, to tear or shred. Titter, to move unsteadily. Tidder, or tidir with a Y, probably pronounced very similar, tidir, because, again, they do a lot of these vowel shifts. Tender or soft, or weak. We also have tudor or tidir, issue, offspring, or seed. Interesting. We have thider, or, well, I put it in twice. Thider, I guess I can take out one. Thider or thither, towards that place. Now this one's interesting. Thider, and here's why. One of the most common shifts that we'll see, mostly we end up seeing it in Anglo-Saxon, but it does end up in other languages too that have a TH sound, at least, is this shift from a D to a TH. And see, since OBRY has both a D letter and a TH letter, that's like a theta, or what they call the Saxon T, which has a th sound. We see that a lot. Happens a bunch, both ways. So in Gaelic, we have thar, over or across, over thar. We have tur, T-U-R, whole or complete. We have titer or tithere, sluggish fellow. Tithere is a sluggish fellow. We have tothere, a plunderer or robber. And I have to wonder and think those two are somehow related. Because, you know, people who are lazy and don't work or whatever, they do tend to be robbers. They take. They're not the only people, and not at our level, of course. Those people who don't want to do slave work that are way up high at the top do the same thing. Except they're far more, I suppose, well-educated. And, well, definitely well-educated. But I was trying to think of a better word. They're far more sophisticated about it than your commonplace poor robber. Now, in German, we have der, D-E-R. What is it? The or there, not T-H-E-I-R. There. Der. To this day, that word. We also have there/dar, that place. So we've got a homonym going on there. Do the two, or can the two, this der as in there, T-H-E-I-R, and dar as in there, T-H-E-R-E, can they actually be more related than we think? I think they probably can. Maybe not so much the they are contraction, but since we saw are actually as a possibility of one of the possible modern cognates with just the simple root air, maybe. Now, in my notes, based on the context of the two verses, this word appears within the information available on H 1725 and 26, dare, from earlier, and a few convincing possible modern cognates available. It's safe to suggest that to dare is an early OBRY form of this thither that we saw. Thither or thither. Thither. Why? Well, because the other shift, consonantal shift we'll see, is from the OBRY T, that hard T, not TH, but the hard T, being shifted to TH. So we can see that in a word like thither. We could see the hard T being replaced with the Saxon TH, T, the, and we could also see the D being shifted to the Saxon T, the, thither, being towards that place or to there. The context of the two verses, both in Isaiah, and really don't take my word on this and all of the shifts that happen in these references. Go check it out for yourself. It happens. It happens a lot. It is a tactic, in of course, my opinion, it is a tactic to hide the roots of a people via hiding the normal natural sounds and the construct, the characteristics of their natural language. Same thing the Masorah accomplishes. Okay, in the context of the two verses, they're both in Isaiah. They're very similar. Both refer to geographical locations, and both occurrences of Teder are followed by u to Ashur, which can be taken as and to Assyria. Although T as a prefix is only recognized in the Masoretic Hebrew as a future tense on a verb, there are many other occurrences of T prefixed to a geographical place. In context, Teder could very well be to, the T, to dare. And we saw many possible modern cognates for dare, indicating there or that place in regards to space. The context of both verses indicate that whatever is being referred to before Berush to dare, u to Asher, in those verses, this phase occurs in the phrase in both verses, and it is translated as the fir, the pine, and the box tree. So it occurs in both verses, almost exactly the same. So it could be things, for instance, that Yahweh would send to the Oreb of Judah. So the Oreb is a location that's mentioned a number of times, actually starting in Genesis and in Joshua in a geographical sense, and it mostly has to do with Judah and Moab, or Moab. So it could be the Oreb of Judah in the first occurrence, and to nations who will not serve a reformed Israel in the second occurrence. In context, the idea that H1265 Baruch is fir is arbitrary, as there are many Rush words with many Masoretic Hebrew definitions, and the B is a common prefix in or near. But when followed by this U to Asher, is when it seems clear that this isn't any other potential form of Ashur, but the nation of Assyria. And since both passages have a place in mind, and Teder is followed by that and, to Ashur, the idea that Teder to Ashur is to there and to Assyria, Ashur, Assyria, that's how they translate it, Syria instead of Ashur. It's not unlikely. In fact, I should have just wrote is likely as opposed to not unlikely. But sometimes I try to soften the blow a little bit. So the rarity of there in the Old Testament is discussed in the De'er table. It appears no times. So it would be interesting if there actually was a way to say something like there, as in describing going to another area, or describing a far distant, or let's just say it doesn't have to necessarily be far, but the D, the pointing or reduction of an idea with the air, which I did go over in the dare, and then the T acting as to, in a future sense perhaps, there, going to there. This isn't odd. This isn't like, oh, maybe he's just making this up to make his case seem stronger. Not at all. I've given you all the evidence. You can check these in context. Take a look at the fact that we have also to Ashur. Ashur is a name. It's used for this nation and people, Ashur, which is always rendered Assyria, Ashur. And it fits. And it fits also with the rest of the cognates in this air family, is the thing. So what do we have? We have, in the wrong order, so I'm going to fix that on the fly. So we have T, a head or an imperfect verb. Since it's so often, in my opinion, successfully, very, very well, it fits when it's used as this future tense verb, as a prefix, a head, or this imperfect verb, plus the D, direction or focus, plus air, area, gap. So in the physical aspect, it could be there or an other specified area. And in the temporal aspect, there, as in other specified time. Thither. That's why the Anglo-Saxon thither. And with that, that does complete the OBRY cognate with possible modern cognates section of this study of air as mountain. After this, there is some real interesting meat when we start looking at all of the supposed mountains that there is supposed to be in this land of Canaan or all surrounding areas. When we look at air in the text, now we don't look at every occurrence of air in the text. There's 500 to 600. But we look at some of the ones that have the greatest potential for us to diagnose whether or not that's being used correctly when it appears as mountain, which is almost always. Except sometimes when mountain doesn't work and they use hill or hill country. We are also going to look at the two main, as I mentioned, but just to recap, we're going to be looking at the two main, what you could call prepositional verbs that seem to offer the most support for air being a mountain or a high place. And these are the ones that have made this extremely complex. Because one, you don't see all that often, and it's yirad, I-R-D, or Y-R-D, yirad. and the other is ole. And the thing about ole has a lot of very close cognates. I mean, closer than just like baol, which would be a cognate, but not very close. We're talking about literally like ol, which appears in a number of Strong's entries, ole, the word itself, but also has other oles that appear as their own Strong's entries. Olut, oliun, there's a good number of them. Oli. Okay, so that one actually gets really complex in just the amount of times that we might see it used throughout the Bible. And it and its very close cognates are used in a very wide number of ways. It's been the thing that has been one of the longest aspects of sorting this whole study out. Right now, this study is about 66 pages of 8.5 by 11, 3/4 inch margins. So a lot to it. And we're going to see if we can get those two big aspects covered in 2 more episodes to soon come. We will pick back up again with episode 15, which will be part 2 in this series that I had entitled The Vertical Flip, but maybe we'll just stick with the study of air as mountain, make it a little easier to follow along with the document when that's published. So until that next one, or my next brief, or my next audio on Patreon. If you're not a patron, it helps so tremendously, and I do provide audios over there for your benefit. Please think about, or just do, become a patron. It does. It really helps, not just me, it helps everyone to get a lot further forward in trying to figure out this confusion that they tell us is reality. So, I will see you next time.